Okay, everyone, thank you for coming out today on this beautiful Friday evening. Honestly, finally, kind of feeling like summer, not just spring, to be here with us to talk about the possible end of NATO. My name's Ryan. I'm the chair of the Maoist Communist Union. We are a pre-party organization here in the United States. And pre-party means we're not a vanguard party, but we aim to build up the party of the working class to lead the revolutionary struggle in the United States for socialism. That's still a ways away. On the other hand, we're living through the beginnings of an unprecedented crisis globally, economically and politically. And I don't say that hyperbolically. I think by the end of this presentation, you will hopefully have a sense, if you don't already, of the tremendous turmoil that lays in front of us and which is basically already set in motion by the Iran war. We are also very, very lucky to have with us here today Karl, the chair of the DKU, the Danish Communist Youth, and he'll introduce his organization himself a little bit.
Hello, everybody. Thank you all for having me here. Communist Youth of Denmark is a revolutionary Maoist youth organization based in Copenhagen and with some chapters across the country. We are in the process of moving from being a youth organization to becoming a pre-party organization, as MCU is, with developing active union work, struggle in the Palestine movement, and an overall struggle to expose the plans of the Danish bourgeoisie as well as the NATO alliance, which is falling apart as we speak. So I look forward to presenting for you, and thank you.
Thank you. And we're very glad to have the DKU here with us today, both because it's an expression of the proletarian internationalism that's so important, because the proletariat as a class, as Marx and Engels noted, properly speaking, has no country. It's an international class. And so the scale of its struggle, while it takes the form of one country at a time, actually ultimately is an international struggle for the liberation of all of humanity, all the oppressed and exploited people. But in particular, given the recent spat over Greenland and other matters between the Danish and the U.S. bourgeoisie, it's particularly important actually to emphasize the bonds of solidarity that need to tie together the working class of Denmark and the U.S. So without further ado, we'll get started. As you all know, the topic for today is the end of NATO, ? We hope to give you something of an answer to that question by the end of today. So let's look at where we're going to go. What's our basic agenda for the day? We have this lovely picture of Trump and Mark Rutte, the head of NATO. For those who don't know, the head of NATO explicitly calls Trump daddy. And Trump said, it's a very nice thing that he does this. This has been the subject of news for about a year for those who have missed it. So this picture somewhat captures that relationship. I don't know if that's quite the right word, but you get the sense. So we're going to go through a series of topics. I'm not going to read them all here, but I'll explain just the first thing that we're going to do is go through a guiding thread of explaining the Marxist understanding of imperialism and how wars arise, and then how that leads to the reconfiguration of global alliances. Karl and I will cover different topics, so we'll be passing the mic back and forth. But in order to make sure that we get the main points, we'll provide some basic theoretical framework first to understand this. And then we'll come back to those points again and again, going through the general theoretical point, some particulars, and the general then will become clearer and clearer. Okay, so I'm going to cover the first section. Here we go. So in order to understand what's going on in NATO today, but also with the Iran war, with US-China competition, with some seemingly strange phenomena, for example, Portugal just completed its first bond sale, Portuguese government debt, denominated not in euros, but in Chinese yuan. This is the second European country to do this. We'll come to this in a minute. But this is a US ally, an EU country, selling its own debt in yuan. Why would it do that? Well, it needs more of the Chinese government's currency to pay back existing debt, so it's borrowing some more of it, but also to buy Chinese goods, because the Chinese companies are increasingly selling them in yuan. This is indicative of the weakening power of the US, as is the spats over NATO, the unwillingness of EU countries to fight in the Iran war, and more. So let's get into it. Why is this happening? Well, a little over 100 years ago, Lenin, in his pamphlet, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, said, what means other than war could there be under capitalism to overcome the disparity between the development of productive forces and the accumulation of capital on the one side and the division of colonies and spheres of influence for finance capital on the other. I'm going to mention this a little bit now and break it down. This point may seem a little confusing. It's kind of theoretical, development of productive forces, accumulation of capital. These are some technical Marxist terms. They're not so hard to understand, but we'll go through some examples to understand them a little better in a second. Let me first explain the basics, and then Karl will get into this a little bit more shortly. Basically, there's an unevenness that develops in the world, inevitably under capitalism, between the power of the respective capitalist countries and the amount of the world's colonies, neo-colonies, loot and plunder they control. And generally speaking, it's not possible for the capitalists, organized as they are into separate national blocks, to resolve these disputes peacefully. Let me put it more simply. The US has a hell of a lot of the world under its thumb, or under its heel, or whatever. Are the US companies going to just peacefully hand over whole sections of the world economy to Chinese companies because those monopolies are now bigger than the US monopolies in some cases? No. They'll in fact send whole other countries' populations to die for these. For markets, for resources, for territory, etc. We see this in the Ukraine war, where the US famously will fight the Russians to the last Ukrainian. But we don't have to go to the Ukraine war. We'll actually get there in a second. Let's just look at a few recent examples to get more of a sense of the redivision of the world. Well, not so recent, but Lenin wrote Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, in the midst of World War I. What you see here on the top is the map of Europe before World War I and the map afterwards. You have a redrawing of the map. Obviously, you have the Russian Revolution, but you have the destruction of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the expansion with the Treaty of Versailles of a lot of control of French, British, and American capital over Central Europe, and the so-called humiliation of Germany, actually very unfair treaties that were put on Germany, and so on. You also had the redistribution of a whole bunch of spheres of control of colonies after World War I. You had the breakup of the Ottoman Empire, the establishment of the various mandates in the Middle East, and so on. So the war was used, not consciously, but it was functionally a means to redivide the world between the capitalist powers. World War II was a bit different because you have the rise of fascism, you have the Soviet Union, which is a socialist country, fighting against the fascist powers. You have this alliance between some of the bourgeois democracies and the socialist Soviet Union against the fascists. But there too you have a redivision of the world, not just between the Soviet Union and the Allies, the other allies, but also between the allies themselves, where France and England, given their weakened position, actually end up having to open up a lot of their colonies to US access that were previously the exclusive domain of French and British capital. What's more, actually the European powers have to open up their own markets to US investment. And these figures, these dollar figures here, are millions of dollars of US investment that was basically forced upon the European powers with the Marshall Plan. The US said, you've got to let us come in and rebuild your factories. So American banks and corporations have a controlling stake in a bunch of European countries. And the French bourgeoisie in particular tried to resist this, but they were forced to accede. And this legacy is why we have NATO. It's why we have so many US bases in Europe and so on. That's not to say the European countries aren't imperialist powers in their own rights, the big ones at least, but they're second fiddle to the US, which established a global empire after World War II. And we can see this redivision, just to give another example, which I already mentioned, but it's evident in much more recent times, in the ongoing Ukraine war. As Karl will break down a little bit later, it's kind of an open secret, especially in Europe, that Ukraine's already lost. It's just a matter of time. Even the European politicians are admitting it. But this is literally a war to redivide not just the territory of Ukraine, but the European gas and energy markets. And actually, partially this is tied to the Middle East and some of the conflict there. I won't get into it all now, but there were some pipelines that might have gone to Europe that would have challenged Russian energy dominance. And this is all being played out. And as people are probably aware, at the start of the war, and even before it, and back in 2014, when the war in a certain sense first began, the US put a bunch of sanctions on Russia to try to freeze Russia and Russian capital out of international markets. So we have this redivision of the world's markets by means of war. Once peaceful competition between the capitalist powers doesn't work, you have war. Okay, it's a simple point, I'm belaboring it, but it's really essential that we understand. And here we have not a map, but a breakdown of all the US military aircraft losses in the first 40 days or so of the Iranian war. So here too, with the Iranian war, we have an attempt to redivide the world, in this case to gobble up Iran, break it into a bunch of separate little countries, and have the US capital dominate Iran. The opposite will likely happen. Actually, in our last event on this, I broke this down in fairly great detail, which is to say the destruction of the US bases and US power in the Middle East has basically happened in the first 40 days of the war, and the US will have to give, at a minimum, significant concessions to the Iranian ruling class in the region. We'll talk a little bit more about that later, but this is just a few examples, both from the past and ongoing, of the capitalists fighting to redivide the world in light of their shifting economic and political power. Now, in order to understand the rise of NATO and the conflict that exists at present within NATO, we have to understand how NATO basically served this purpose. You can see here a map of NATO and the dates that each country joined the alliance. And what you'll notice is most of these countries, the first wave of joining is really during the Cold War, when the threat of the rising socialist powers and the national liberation struggles threatens American and European capital, and they're fused together in NATO. And then once the Soviet Union, there's a restoration of capitalism there, and then there's a collapse of the Soviet Union later in the 90s, beginning of the 90s, you have a massive wave of NATO expansion, where the capitalists that had existed in the Soviet Union, they lost a lot of their power. Russia was a weak country, divided after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and so NATO expanded eastward and cemented American and Western and Central European capitals' control of Eastern Europe, the Balkans, and started to push and encroach more and more into spheres that had previously been part of the Soviet Union and Russia. Now, more recently, what we've seen, though, is the breakdown of this alliance, which has been so central to maintaining the US-led economic and political order, what they love to call the rules-based order. Rules for who? Rules for the capitalists and the imperialists. And just to give a few examples, and we'll talk more about these a bit later, of the level of division within NATO and the impending crisis, really, that NATO's facing. At the start of this war, Spain, which has been in NATO for a very long time, as you see, decided to refuse to allow the US troops access to Spanish bases and Spanish airspace for the war. As I noted, Portugal, which was in NATO since 1949, just sold its own government debt in Chinese yuan. Slovenia did that last year too, started selling debt in yuan. This is indicative of the economic relations and inroads that China has made into NATO. Italy has just cut its trade deals with Israel, quite significant given Meloni's very far-right politics. France has talked about setting up its own nuclear umbrella over Europe, separate from the US nuclear umbrella. Basically, the US is protecting Europe with its nukes. France says, no, we'll protect you instead of the US. And Poland has said it wants to develop its own nuclear weapon to protect itself. And Turkey, and this is something we'll talk on later, as you saw on the agenda, has said that it will join the war with Iran on the side of the Iranians, functionally, against Israel and against the Kurdish forces if the US arms the Kurdish forces. So we have, to put it lightly, a bit of a shit show in NATO that's unfolding, and it's just getting started. Okay, but how do we understand that? Well, Karl's going to take it from here on the topic and talk about the decline of the US.
Right after World War II, the United States stood as an unprecedented economic, political, and military power. By using this colossal might, they were able to transform the world system, which had existed previously and was destroyed through the war, fundamentally. They used this might to set up not only NATO to protect their interests, but to consolidate and build up the UN. They built institutions such as the World Bank and IMF, financial institutions which not only helped them export their capital worldwide and dominate the capital of other imperialist countries, but they also used this position to support anti-colonial movements and to break away colonies from many of the old European powers. The most central aspect to understand of this system that the US set up of relations between the powerful capitalist countries is the Bretton Woods system. We're not going to get completely into this right now, but the basics of it is that the US dollar was backed by gold and the US government, and each other country would make their currency dependent on the dollar. This gave the US an unprecedented level of control over international trade and the economies of the rest of the capitalist countries of the world. So what we're pulling up here is just to illustrate the degree to which the US position in the world since then has changed. This is the share of nominal world GDP. Of course, not the best marker, but it can give a sense. In 1960, it was 38% of the world share. That's been a little bit higher if you go closer to the war, but that's just the data we had. If you look to already in 2012, they're down to 22.5. If you compare that to China, going from 4.6 to 11.4, and this tendency has increased and continued very much at very rapid speed since then, which can be illustrated if we look at how global manufacturing, one of the most important indicators of the actual weight of a capitalist country and the ability of it to control the world market, the US was surpassed by China already in 2010. Another important indicator, electricity generation. China is just robbing the United States and other competitors like the European Union in the mud. So while this system favored the United States, the system was set up in a way which relied on the US remaining the most mighty of the capitalist countries forever, which is somewhat not, it is illogical, because as any capitalist nation is based on capitalist economics, the different capitalist nations have different rates of growth. This, to be simplified very much, can be explained by the concept of diminishing returns. To spend $100 million reconfiguring and improving, keeping some factories going is nowhere as profitable as building $100 million of new factories. And this is the reason that the investments which were invested in Europe post-World War II and in China, among other reasons, eventually outcompeted the US, causing a growing divergence between the actual relation of forces that enabled the setting up of the system. Another graph to illustrate here, just comparison between China and the US. You can see how in every important category for the international competition of these imperialist powers, China is completely crushing the US. So you can see how this kind of difference in economic might cannot reflect an international system of relations between nations that is based on total US domination. There's a sharpening contradiction between the way the world system is set up and the actually existing relation of the forces within that world system, the relation between the nations, the relations of their relative economic might. And don't just take it from communists. The US funded and controlled Council on Foreign Relations is openly discussing the setting up of a separate economic trade system that cuts out China. Basically a declaration of defeat within the existing system. So all this makes the creation of a new international, both economic and political system inevitable. This includes the transformation or destruction of institutions such as NATO, UN, World Bank, IMF. For a while this system actually continued to exist, China was able to use the system for their own ends. Because of the openness to trade, they were able to take advantage of the access to all the oppressed nations that the US had kept open, and this allowed China to grow very fast. But with the might they have now, even this is not sufficient for them. They are looking for a redivision. At the same time, the US is also looking for a redivision and for a change of the system, because it's not actually sufficiently helping them to protect their grasp over world domination. Their control and ability to project power across the world is slipping. as we're seeing with the current developments. So it's not just one side looking for this redivision. It's objectively necessary and and each side believes it'll be in their interest to bring this forward.
So all of this raises the question, the US is getting beat at almost every level in this competition. They're acknowledging to some degree they need some new institutions, etc. But really we have to ask the question that this analysis brings forward, will the US ruling class actually accept this reality? Because it's one thing to say, okay, we need to reconfigure, maybe make a new World Trade Organization. It's another thing for them to say, holy shit, we're losing on every single front. We need to either do something very drastic, which to be frank, it's too late to actually defeat China in a number of these fronts. That had to happen probably 20 years ago. And there were debates amongst the ruling class if they should take this sort of action 20-something years ago. They had the war on terror instead. But now the question really is, how great will the defeat be? Can the US accept a strategic retreat from a series of different markets around the world, or at least a massive setback in those markets? Or will they double down and double down and double down, refusing to face the reality on the ground and lose much worse? What do y'all think?
Double down.
Let's see. So to get a sense, let's look at some recent kind of history in the US. How has the US ruling class dealt with various issues they faced? Well, remember the dot-com boom? The US ruling class said it would never end. Now, I know some members kind of understood it would, but a lot of them invested very much with the belief, a lot of them very wealthy, intelligent, like in the sense Bill Ackman's intelligent people, they invested heavily in this boom and lost a hell of a lot of money. Okay, with the dot-com boom, that's just one thing. They believed in the end of history. Francis Fukuyama was extremely popular. The US ruling class believed they would never fight another war against a peer competitor. So what do? They cut more than half of their planned production of their top-end jets, the F-22s. They scuttled the plans to make more repair parts. Now they're having big trouble in this war because these F-22s, over 30 years old, the plane design, they've updated a little bit, but it's old. They don't have enough of them. They don't have enough parts for them. They're actually not nearly as dominant as they thought they would be. They're trying to play catch up for decisions they made 30 years ago based on stupid assessments. Another stupid belief they had, seriously had, the world is flat. Globalization, it's so great, it's going to make everyone wealthy. Now, of course, the capitalists didn't quite believe this, but they really believed that every single country would kind of become more and more like the US. Hence why they decided to admit China to the World Trade Organization, believing this would lead to Chinese capitalist subordination to US and European interests, but especially to US interests. And let's just look at that graph again. How did that work out for the US? Oh yeah, 26 years later, not very well. Now let's look at the wars. Historically, did they make good decisions about warfare, controlling things, winning victories, etc.? Well, remember Cheney said, we'll be greeted as liberators going into Iraq. Even after that very clearly wasn't the case, Cheney continued to insist over and over again that his assessment was correct, the Iraq war was not a strategic mistake for the US, and so on and so forth. One can argue, okay, he got very personally wealthy, and that's why he's saying that, and Halliburton profited immensely, but that actually is part of the point. Individual capitalist interests and their profit motives often come into serious conflict with the overall interests of the US capitalist class. And the US capitalists do not have a developed mechanism to basically discipline the whole class through the state to say, get in line, you're going to lose some profits, but we need to hold on to our fucking territory. And the polymarketification of everything shows this. I mean, the Trump administration is looting everything that's not nailed down for short-term profits that makes them fabulously wealthy, wealthier. But how does that impact the US's long-term viability as an empire? It hurts it, not helps it. But okay, Iraq war, let's talk about that. What did they think? Karl Rove, leading ideologue for the Bush administration, he said, we are an empire now. When we act, we create our own reality. I mean, this is subjective idealism through and through. We act, reality follows. He said, we're history's actors, meaning the US empire, and all of you will be left to just study what we do. He meant the European powers, the Chinese, the Russians, etc. How did it work out in Iraq? Oh yeah, China, not the US, after 20 plus years, emerged as the dominant economic partner of Iraq. There was no stable US client state. There was no long-term US control of the Iraqi oil fields. None of it. The US still has some presence in Iraq, although a lot of that was just defeated in the 40 days of the first 40 days of the war. But China overwhelmingly won out economically from the Iraq war, not the US. Again, individuals got wealthy, but China secured long-term access to the Middle East, secured a lot of oil, very strategic given they need to import oil, and so on. So the US effort in the Iraq war not only did not aid the US empire, but it actually aided their major emerging rival, the Chinese imperialists. And when the US realized this was a mistake, did they stop pouring money into Iraq? No, they doubled down and doubled down and doubled down. Let's go through a couple more examples. Shifting a huge amount of the US economy into speculation and housing. This undermined the US's defense production, but it got some people, the banks and the realtors and the construction industry, very wealthy. They said, oh, there'll never be a problem with this. We won't have a major housing bubble. And then once it started, they said, oh, Bear Stearns won't fail. Oh, Lehman Brothers won't fail. Okay, it's contained. There won't be a general financial crisis. Okay, it's a general financial crisis, but don't worry. Ben Bernanke in the Federal Reserve, they'll print money and we'll have a quick economic recovery and everything will go back to normal and Obama's in office and there's the unemployment rate. We never saw a return to post-2008 normal. Not that that was some paradise, but the point is they were not able to actually deal with the structural problems that existed in the economy, and unemployment remained elevated for a prolonged period of time. This is a graph that basically, from a website that actually gives some clearer breakdown of the statistics around unemployment, because if you know, in the US, you're only counted as unemployed if you're actively collecting unemployment insurance. So once you're no longer working but have run out of unemployment insurance, or if you got fired and you can't collect it, you're not counted as unemployed. So just looking at the actual numbers, we can see that most of the decrease in unemployment post-2008 was actually people no longer being able to collect the unemployment money, not people actually getting a job. Okay, so given this subjectivism, let's look at how the US is handling the Iran war and the possible strategic retreat they may have to book from the Middle East. Well, Marco Rubio said the US only makes 6 to 7 interceptors per month, and Iran makes 100 missiles and thousands of drones a month. So if you need to shoot one missile interceptor to shoot down one drone, how does the math work on that war? Not very well. This is a graphic. It shows on a much bigger scale the problems here. I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but you can see basically the huge gap in productive capacity of the US for warfighting versus Iran, which is quite striking given the US is a dominant global empire and Iran is at best a regional power. It will emerge from this war as a very strong regional power, but it's not a global empire. It's a country that's much smaller than the US. It's been under sanctions for a very long time, and before that was under a brutal US-backed dictator. So it's quite striking that the US can't beat a country like Iran. How do you think they'll fare against a country like China? But don't worry, guys. Pete Hegseth is making up Bible verses that he stole from Pulp Fiction. He was condemned by the Pope for this. And meanwhile, Republicans are talking about how Trump is almost the second coming of Christ, and Trump is tweeting out pictures of himself as the second coming of Christ. So it seems like there's some real solid objectivity and clarity. Okay, and then if we go through Trump's claims, these are just a few of them. I think Trump has actually claimed on 15 separate occasions that Iran's navy is totally wiped out, which would be news to the oil tankers who tried to transit the Strait of Hormuz today and were turned back by Iran's navy. So what's going on here? Well, partially Trump's lying. The administration's promoting kind of messianic religious stuff, so US soldiers will be willing to die based on some conviction that the apocalypse is coming and Jesus is coming back and so on. But also we have to face the reality. Was that sort of craziness, Trump's lies, and messianic Christianity at the forefront of the U.S. loss in Afghanistan or Iraq? No, it wasn't. There's deep structural problems in the U.S. military and in the U.S. ruling class overall, in the U.S. government, with an ability to fairly objectively assess a situation, come to a unified decision that the U.S. bourgeoisie follows, and carry out things they assess to be in their interest. So while Trump may be lying, or he may be fed lies by people below him, the reality is they are not able to, the U.S. ruling class, they are not able to understand the situation very well. And we can see this with the recent rounds of negotiations. They have actually an extreme difficulty realizing that Iran is not going to concede on the basic demands, and that after 40 days of whooping the US's ass in war, Iran is in a stronger negotiating position, not a weaker one. Hence why the talks in Islamabad went nowhere, and both sides left without any agreement. Now there's been a ceasefire today, and then within 5 minutes, Israel violated it, and then Trump said the Strait of Iran is open. Strait of Hormuz, whatever. Details are not his strong suit. And then Iran turned back ship after ship and tanker after tanker, and very few translated today. So the point here is to say we can see the U.S. ruling class is not able to deal with these situations very objectively, and they tend to double down and double down and double down. It's one thing to double down and throw trillions of dollars into a money pit where you lose incremental ground, but in the end, the basic interests of the U.S. in the region are not totally destroyed. It's another thing to double down on a war where in 40 days of fighting, your military adversary destroyed every major base you have in the region that was within range of their missiles. Just damaged so severely your two biggest aircraft, or two of your most important aircraft carriers, and also another important ship, that they had to flee the theater of war, and where the U.S. ruling class was unable to exert almost any significant military pressure on Iran, as we can see with the pace of drone and missile fire. That sort of doubling down leads to an unprecedented catastrophe, which I think we will see as soon as the official fighting resumes, probably on Sunday.
And to really drive home the degree to which the US and its allies are facing an unprecedented catastrophe, it's helpful to understand that even besides this war, the US is facing a general polycrisis. Basically, a multifaceted crisis, which is both military, economic, political, ideological. As you can see here, it's even being discussed in bourgeois media. So on the military front, the major losses that the US has sustained in Iran, losing important missile systems in the beginning of the war, has already forced them to pull many missile systems from South Korea and many other.
I just pulled up.
Yeah,
I got you.
And many other countries where the US has their military posted to Iran. If they're churning through it this fast, how's it going to look if the war lasts till September or further than that? This is weakening the US's military grip across Asia, the Middle East, and the rest of the world, in fact. And this military presence is what is propping up both NATO and the international system that we're currently living in. To rebuild their THAAD missile systems, what do they need? Rare earths, which are only available basically from China. The crisis is also economic. This isn't just because of the current speculative AI bubble, it actually goes deeper than that. For the past couple hundred years, across the capitalist world, about every 10 years, there's been a cyclical crisis. In some bourgeois economy, it's called the business cycle. But basically, we've seen it around every 10 years. And it actually tends to be that every 50 years, there's a particularly difficult crisis. We had the 1930s depression, the 70s oil crisis, some of the hardest crises, followed by violent and explosions of mass initiative and resistance. And usually at the peak of these crises, what are the signs? You see wanton speculation and this kind of circular trading. You see different AI companies passing money around, pretending they're making money. You see many companies across the world are firing. I know even in Denmark, many of the largest monopolies are firing. I know in America, many are being fired, and many are not being hired. And they excuse it by saying, we are employing more AI, and therefore we don't need to hire or fire anyone. And then they pretend that it's actually AI making money, but it's actually, in fact, just them not being able to employ more people, not being able to make more money with the current economic conditions. And just to underline this, people are pulling their money out of AI already. This is like from a credit, what's it called?
A private credit.
Private credit corporation that invests in AI, which basically has a lot of money invested there. And this is the blue thing you see increasing here is the amount of money people are pulling out of the private credit fund. And the blue stuff here, you see the light blue, represents people not being able to get their money back. So basically people are pulling so much money out of AI that they're not able to get their money back. What does that look like? Basically a run on the banks, which isn't just a crisis sign, that's the beginning of the crisis. So this problem existed before the war, and it's not caused by the war. It's not just because of these problems that this exists. This is happening alongside the war, and in fact, in some ways, the war is a way to attempt frantically to prevent or postpone this kind of inevitable crash. Basically, the US Treasury Secretary is concerned that there's going to be a collapse in demand for treasuries. What does this mean? Basically, treasuries are denominated in US dollar. This is basically meaning that the dollar is threatened. So also, this crisis, beyond the capitalist economic problems, there's also a material crisis, which is more directly caused by the war. Critical resources, not just oil, are blocked from passing through the Hormuz Strait. Within a very short time, both in Europe and America, there's going to be material shortages of several basic goods.
Just to say, so Qatar, it produces 1/5 of the world's liquefied natural gas, which is needed for markets all over the world, for cars, I mean, not for cars, for production, but a whole bunch of other things, actually. They're derivative products created by natural gas. But even just the energy sector alone, the oil and gas disruptions have led, as you see here, to oil being sold, not the paper oil in the futures markets, but the actual delivery of oil well over $200 a barrel in Asia. These are the new norms which are emerging, which will soon be surpassed as the ships that left the strait at the start of the war are just arriving in their destinations now. There's not many more ships leaving. So we're going to see prices like this going up. And then everything that uses oil and gas to make energy, which is basically everything, goes up more from that.
Yeah, and as you can see, airlines are already canceling because jet fuel is running out. What do you use liquefied natural gas to make? Fertilizer. A lot of the world's fertilizer is made in the Middle East, and in fact, a third of the world's fertilizer goes through the Strait of Hormuz, or it used to. And you can imagine how this affects food prices. And as you see, food prices easily connected to social turmoil. You see how when the food price index here hits an all-time high, you have the Arab Spring. And with now, it's going even higher. This is the leader of the International Energy Agency, who is saying that the world has never seen an energy disruption of this scale. The crisis, he says, is worse than both the oil crisis in the 70s and the 1930s depression. So just to get a sense of how serious of a disruption we're dealing with. Yeah, and finally, I want to bring some light on the political and ideological crisis developing in the capitalist countries. The legitimacy of the ruling class in Europe and in America is increasingly challenged. The formulations which has been used so far to get people to buy in and accept the policy by the ruling class, which is not fundamentally in their interest, is falling apart. So now you can see for a time, Trump was able to win a significant section of the population over to his particular articulation and worldview for a while, which somewhat justified the ruling class. But they were only able to do this by promising people to end the wars. They were promising them free speech. They were promising them to release the Epstein files and all sorts of other crimes of the US government. Basically, the US having to put out these kinds of things to justify their rule is like pissing to keep yourself warm. Because what is going to happen once they get in? People are going to require that, and that's because they are fundamentally chauvinistic and stupid, and they believe people are so short-sighted that they'll forget what you promised 1 minute ago, which apparently has worked for them before, but not this time. In Europe, we're still, you maybe don't know this very much, but we're still hearing the same drivel about international law and international institutions and stuff. Like they're still speaking the same language of the neoliberal era and the period before that, and thinking that people will be rallied around protecting this kind of UN-led world order, the order set up for the US to defend itself. And it's just completely absurd, because people can see through their experience both how the world system and this kind of international law has completely failed to uphold what it claimed to uphold by draw the wars in the Middle East, and particularly with the youth now in Denmark, we're seeing so many people following how the war, like genocide carried out by Israel in Gaza, has been completely untouched by this so-called international system of law. So you really think that people of Europe are going to buy into this kind of explanation or justification for the rule anymore? It's not going to work, unless for some smaller section of people who are have some kind of interest in it. But for the vast masses of workers and the youth, it's not going to work. So there's an ideological and political crisis already, which is the kind of things that the ruling class would need to subdue the mass enthusiasm and resistance, really, against all these other crises compounding. So overall, you can see how a multifaceted polycrisis is developing, which is not just rooted in this war. It existed before the war, but the war has given it several additional prongs and heads, several additional facets, and several additional, and has greatly intensified it. So as you can see, even Bloomberg is reporting the Iran war just broke the petrodollar. Welcome to multidimensional economic disaster. It's basically universally recognized. Yeah, that's all I have on this one.
Yeah. So given all this, it's really only in the context of this polycrisis, basically a crisis of crises, a whole bunch of them all together, that we can understand the possible end of NATO. Because typical sort of spats between the US and European bourgeoisie over trade or tariffs, they come up. Even, the role of the euro internationally, there was some kerfuffle over that when Saddam Hussein was going to start selling oil in euros back right before the Iraq War. And they were mad at each other. The Bush administration started calling French fries freedom fries. But in those simpler times, there was no real discussion of the end of the NATO alliance or the possible end or breakup of the Eurozone. But right now, at every single level, the system that was set up post-World War II, that was then patched up in the crisis of the 70s, and which was given a bit of new life with the fall of the Soviet Union at the beginning of the 90s, is in an unprecedented crisis. And the idiocy of the US bourgeoisie launching this war in the way they did has exacerbated it. As Karl noted, they believed this war would maybe give them the system a new life. You bust up part of Iran, you get cheap oil, the Gulf states get some more profit, they start investing more in AI, and you get another 5 years or whatever. They don't really think quite on those terms, but more profits is great. Then we have Palantir surveilling every move. The US gets Greenland. We have giant AI data centers there and robot dogs killing us in the streets if we step out of line or whatever. Their paradise, our hell. But in starting this war, they grossly miscalculated. Actually, Trump said today, oil prices are so low, but they warned me if I started this war, they'd be $300. Well, the paper oil prices, the futures are kept low because of manipulation in the market, which worked out how well for Nixon in the 70s? Terribly. the Nixon administration, for those who don't know, basically tried to suppress inflation for a couple of years, and it's universally regarded as having made it much, much worse. The suppression of oil prices is happening in paper markets, whereas in physical markets, it's almost $300 a barrel in some places. So all of this, once one begins to internalize it, maybe feels a bit terrifying. Food prices skyrocketing, the whole world that we've known, basically most of us for all of our lives, starting to come crumbling down. What do we do? I mean, the standard response of a lot of the US petty bourgeoisie is what? Goblin mode. Just veg out, eat all the ice cream you want, watch reels, Netflix, pretend it's not happening, play video games, whatever. Escapism. But we can't, as communists, accept that approach. We have to have the courage to face the reality as it is and then fight to change the world. And that's the basic thing at the heart of Marxism. And so if we look to what Mao said, there is great disorder in the heavens, the situation is excellent. Now in China, there's a kind of saying like, oh, the mandate of heaven, basically the existing powers are in chaos. The world right now is in chaos. That's excellent. Why? Because peacetime under capitalism means non-stop oppression if you're lucky enough to live. And if you're not lucky enough to live, it means death and destruction. We know and we're taught very well to understand the horrors of the Second World War and Nazism and the Holocaust. What's not typically discussed, for example, is the crimes of the British Empire, who in the late Victorian period killed, the latter part of the 19th century, around 90 million people. That's called the late Victorian Holocaust. Or the US sanctions regime, which according to a recent study, just the sanctions alone since the 70s killed 37 million people. That's not wars. That's not, bombings or unexploded munitions or famine. That's sanctions alone. That's the peacetime. So as terrifying as the coming situation and chaos may seem, we should be square. Of course, there are very negative possibilities, but there's also tremendous openings for change insofar as the dominant global empire is falling, or at least facing major setbacks, and is not capable to maintain its grip on the world and the peoples of the world. There will be huge popular struggles for freedom and emancipation, which will give us a chance to really change things in the way, the last 20, 30 years haven't been possible. Okay, with all of this as something of our framing, let's talk a bit about the Iran war and one particular NATO ally, namely Turkey. Now, I don't know how many people here have watched some of the dissent and dissenting views amongst the US bourgeoisie, various figures of the ruling class. I'm not talking friends of the people. I mean people like Tucker Carlson. This is one of the most watched and prominent commentators in the US. He's very closely tied to the CIA and a bunch of big capitalists. And he says, the American empire is over and the country is becoming unrecognizable amid the war. Now, as we noted at the beginning of this presentation, NATO is a key pillar of the US empire. So we'll understand a bit more what Tucker's referring to in a bit, and his analysis is a little bit off, but there's some truth to it. I'm putting him up here because he's a bourgeois commentator who's highlighting these sort of structural changes and the crisis that exists. So Turkey has been a key US NATO ally basically from almost the beginning of NATO. In the Cuban Missile Crisis, Turkey was essential to planning the war, potentially that could break out between the US and the Soviet Union. All plans for US nuclear strikes on the Soviet Union involved Turkey, where many US nukes were and are stationed. So that's to say, it's quite a significant thing that Turkey is seriously contemplating joining the war on Iran's side, even if not officially on Iran's side, to fight the US and Israel. It's actually crazy that it's happening. An ally for the US of 70 years is saying that it will fight on the opposite side of the US in the war. To give a sense of the US military presence in Turkey, a lot of it's semi-secret, but this is from 2016, a map of some of the US military positions. Now, US-Turkey relations really degraded actually in 2016, right before Trump was elected, when the Gulenists in Turkey, whose leader was driven out of Turkey by the ruling party, the AKP, they tried to stage a coup with US backing in 2016 and it failed. since that point, Turkey has been actually much more recalcitrant against US interests. And Turkey has, for example, something of the military might to back it up. This chart shows the relative size of NATO militaries in blue, and then the Russian and Ukrainian military in red and yellow, respectively. This is actually something of an underestimate. It's estimated that Turkey has somewhere closer to 500,000 active duty troops. Plus, they have a lot of mercenaries in Syria and elsewhere. So they're quite a big military, not just in numbers of troops, but also in military power. They have a powerful navy, air force, etc. And since the 2016 failed coup attempt in Turkey, the US tried to then basically use various mechanisms to force Erdogan's government to accede to US demands. They refused. They actually had acquired big gold reserves, in part because of their trade with Iran, which happened under Obama. And what ended up happening was Turkey was able to develop its own domestic industry, somewhat to a greater degree independent than the US. And I'll talk about this a little bit more later. But Turkey now has its own independent military industry, arms industry, which is actually slated to make a fifth generation fighter jet before the EU, to give a sense of the scale of the Turkish arms industry. It's going to make a fifth generation fighter jet before the EU. Maybe. We'll see if it actually happens, but they're making state-of-the-art arms that are being sold around the world. Turkish drones and other technologies are being used on both sides in the Ukraine war. And given all this and Turkey's expansion into Syria, which happened during the Trump administration, the Israeli ruling class, even before this war with Iran, basically started to signal fairly explicitly that Turkey was next. They said, after we deal with Iran, we're going to deal with Turkey, which is pretty crazy. Two major US allies in the region, one saying, we're going to take out the other. And again, before the war, Netanyahu made this clear. This is you can't quite see, but it's February 23rd. They're making it clear that Turkey's a threat to Israel, and a lot of big Israeli media channels were saying, we need to be ready to go to war with Turkey soon. And they believed, of course, the Iran war would be a cakewalk, and then they'd march into Turkey and carve it up, and so on and so forth. Now, the Turkish ruling class is not stupid. And so just a few days ago, the Turkish finance minister said that Turkey will be labeled as the new adversary by Israel as soon as this war is over, because Israel can't sustain itself without an enemy. Okay, so you get a sense of this. Here's some breakdown of a little bit of what Erdogan said, that they would join the war on the side, at least against the US forces, if the US armed the Kurds, which would bring them into direct conflict most likely with the US military, but also against Israel, and potentially Israeli-backed forces in Syria. Now, why is Turkey talking about this? Well, Erdogan was very clear in a speech a couple weeks ago. He said, the old order is collapsing, and yet it's not fully clear what will replace it. And he said, our world is rapidly being dragged into a chaotic period in which brute force and the law of the powerful prevail. He's right. This is just an objective statement from a bourgeois statesman with expansionist aims. Turkey has long sought to expand in the region, has been investing heavily abroad, has some powerful military forces, weapons industry, etc. And they have a real possibility, the ruling class there, they believe, they could be wrong, but to massively expand their power in the region, especially if Israel's crushed in this war, and if the Saudis face a crisis, and so on. And there's some popular ideological support in Turkey for the kind of the remaking of an Ottoman-style empire, even if not quite in those terms. And this was actually a statistic that really surprised me that I saw the other day. After the United States, Turkey has the second most military bases abroad of any country in the world. It's estimated that Turkey has 133 military bases abroad. A huge number of them are in Africa, actually. Turkey has signed a series of very important military and economic agreements with Somalia. In particular, and Turkish military ships operate off Somalia, off the coast of it. Turkey has exclusive economic rights to some of the gas there off the coast of Somalia. And as I'm sure you all saw, Israel is trying to sponsor a breakaway region in Somalia, Somaliland, to be a new little Israeli colony. And so just today, Somalia said, I'm sure at the behest of Turkey, that if the war restarts, they will enter into the war, Somalia will enter into the war and support the Houthis in the closing of Bab el-Mandeb, the strait in the Red Sea. So we're talking about potential major escalation if the war restarts, which I think it almost certainly will. And Turkey even using some of their significant influence in the Somali military and possibly deploying their own troops to exert their influence in the region. Turkey has been for years training the Somali military, helping them fight the counterinsurgency in their country and so on. So this is kind of hard to understate that the US may end up on the opposite side of this war as the second biggest military in NATO, while the rest of NATO basically sits the war out. I mean, it's almost unthinkable 3 years ago that this would happen, 2 years ago. And it may still be unthinkable for some people today, but it's very much a possibility that's on the table. And this can only happen in a situation where the US's power is just so globally diminished. And we can't understand Turkey's talk about entry into the war without understanding, as Karl already covered a bit, and I talked about a bit too, the scale of US defeat in this war. Because US deterrence has been destroyed. I mean, the US basically used most of its missile interceptors, used a huge portion of its radars, the mobile ones, went through a huge portion of its stealth cruise missiles, which were reserved, most of them, for a potential war with Russia and China, and failed to do anything significant to defeat Iran's military capacity. The US's role, as Karl said earlier, as the global policeman is over. And if the US can't act as the global policeman, a whole bunch of countries that have regional power and have significant military and economic might to back it up will operate, as Erdogan said, according to the law of might makes right. And that's actually basically the law of capital in international relations. So we will see that increasingly. So hopefully that convinces you how deep the crisis is in NATO. Now let's look to the U.S.-EU relations.
Yes, since we're going to Europe, I put on my Zelensky shirt here last time. So the U.S.-EU breakup has been ongoing for a couple of years, but it's been more one-sided as until recently. Of course, the US, even though they set up this world system, they're also clearly losing within it, as we talked about earlier. So they've been putting through some half-baked plans of restructuring the relationship between Europe and the US in recent years. And this has been reflected in, for example, the tariff conflict earlier last year. But overall, the reaction from a lot of the European powers, at least in the public, has been to kind of wait it out and hope to see if Trump is going to be voted out again. But at some point, they will have to face reality. And I think this was a process that was already ongoing. You have people saying, oh, well, what if it doesn't change and stuff like that. But now with the war and with the consequences being brought forth, which are going to possibly affect Europe even harder in the short term than the US, this facade of attempting to save this relationship, at least in the form that it had before, is falling apart. And we're going to show how that is taking shape. Spain said that the US can't use their airspace or the joint US-Spain military bases for their war in Iran. And not just that, Spain has visited China very recently, together with the UAE and Russia. Oh, sorry.
I think it was Russia.
Yeah, it was Russia. And Russia, basically to talk about the safety in the Strait of Hormuz, but clearly overall also talking about a general restructuring of relations. This is the most open, basically, endorsement of China and the greatest step towards China we've seen of any European power so far. this is completely unprecedented, this kind of thing. We're seeing Denmark basically publicly saying through the Danish state-owned broadcasting service has recognized that Denmark is planning to blow up the runways, like the places where the planes land in Greenland, if they believe the US is about to attack. They also, in the same article, said that if the US were to attack, they would resist militarily to try to make it costly politically for the US to attack. When it's been in Denmark until about 5 minutes ago, the only thing you could hear from any politician was just that the US is the greatest friend, we'll be friends forever, and we just love each other so much. You know, it's more lovely than anything else in the world. Other than that, we have France, while opening their new nuclear submarine, is announcing that they want to make a nuclear umbrella to cover most of Europe. Many countries are negotiating with France to be a part of this nuclear umbrella, meaning that France will retaliate if countries strike them with nuclear weapons, which was basically done through the NATO before. So this is a direct replacement of NATO and US and a consolidation of French power. In Germany recently, there was a law passed, or it was proposed, that basically the Bundeswehr, the German military, had to approve if you were a man below 45 who had to leave the country for more than 3 months. This was rolled back because of public backlash, but it gets a sense of how dire and how intensely the European bourgeoisie is struggling with rearming and replacing NATO in the short term. And you see, further than that, for many years, there was a divide within the European capitalists, where many of the capitalists who were backing the center or center-left parties and also many center-right parties were more solidly for only EU integration. And there was a fringe far-right which was against EU integration and was even closer with USA. Now this right, the ones who have been speaking for Trump's policies and trying to apply MAGA in Europe, all of them on a dime have turned against Trump, and many have lost power. In Hungary, Peter Orban, Trump's strongest ally, was just voted out and replaced by Peter Magyar, which is like also a right-wing guy, but not supporting the US. And then Giorgia Meloni, of course, also breaking up with Trump, and forces even similar in Denmark, like the Danish People's Party, a very racist party, who have been speaking for closer alliance with the US instead of EU, have condemned the US actions against Greenland and the war in Iran. So the situation is quickly developing, and the relationship between the US and Europe is being transformed as we speak, basically.
Yeah, so hopefully this gives a sense of really how severe the crisis is and the scale of the contradictions within NATO, the scale of the problems the US ruling class is facing in managing their global empire, and some of the maneuvers and machinations of various forces, imperialist powers and countries who aspire to become imperialist powers, countries like Turkey, in the face of these very turbulent times. So with that sort of stuff presented, we're going to shift gears a little bit now, and we have a few kind of topics for Karl and I to discuss a bit more loosely with you all, less in a presentation style, but there's about 4 topics we're going to go through now, where one of us will open it, we'll talk a little bit back and forth, handing the mic back, to kind of dive into a little bit more of some, I don't know, like questions, broader political questions tied up in all this. So Karl's going to start us off.
Yes. So the first topic we overall want to open up is, what does the breakdown of NATO mean? And in particular, I want to shed some light on a point that many, even on the European left, and as Americans you may not know this, many somewhat fear the collapse of NATO because of the Ukraine war and Russia's expansion, and they fear that if NATO isn't there, that it's going to put the people of Denmark in danger. But here it's very important to underline that NATO was never an alliance that was geared for actually defending the countries of the alliance. It has mainly been an aggressive military alliance for projecting imperialist power in different oppressed nations and for fighting different imperialist competitors. You can see that with NATO slowly expanding east in the last 20 years, moving the row of missiles closer to Russia and basically sharing a great responsibility in the conflict bringing forth here. So the NATO and the collaboration with the US has not in any way made Denmark safe. In fact, it has much rather made it much less unsafe.
And tied to this, there's a related conception, not in the US, not only that NATO keeps people safe, but that the US empire keeps us safe. You only have to turn on Fox News or, even kind of more populist-y podcasts like Joe Rogan or Theo Vaughn or something to kind of see this idea that outside of the US and the world is some sort of kind of place full of barbarians with just chaos and disorder and so on and so forth. Now, of course, there are countries ripped apart by war, failed states, as the US bourgeoisie likes to call some too. But these are the result of the imperialist system, problems created by US imperialism or by other imperialist powers. But what's more, we can see that for the people of the US, we've paid a tremendous price for the empire. While some have reaped some marginal benefits, especially amongst the upper stratum of the working class and the petty bourgeoisie, been able to enjoy a little bit more Netflix, cheap TVs, lots of poisonous food for cheap. It's pretty grim when you put it like that, but that's the reality. That's what people are talking about. That's our way of life. I mean, give me a break. It's a living hell. And there's been broad kind of social acknowledgement of this vacuousness of imperialist society for some time. But many citizens in the empire, in the US, feel, but wouldn't it be so much worse without an empire? I mean, just look at the problems we face. Falling literacy rates, the turning of all culture into extremely short-form content. I mean, have you seen a Hollywood movie recently? It opens with like a giant action scene and just like nonstop like stimulation, little in the way of plot or logical continuity. That's just at a cultural level. Forget about the economic and problems people face here as a very, very tiny minority are very wealthy and the rest of us are very poor. But we also can see that the empire very clearly doesn't keep the US safe. I mean, just constant wars abroad and the endless bellicosity of the US have threatened the people here in many ways. It's a pretty, for those who don't naively believe in the empire, it's a pretty cynical and dark view. So what if billions are oppressed? If I'm supposedly kept a little safer? It's not true that people are safer because of the empire, but it's also very dark. And that logic needs to be pointed out. It's a similar logic you see at play with NATO. But we should be square that the end of the US as an empire is a good thing for the people of this country. And we also need to be square that even some of the populist right are saying that. Ron Paul said it, but also even Tucker says the end of the empire is a good thing for the US. They mean very different things than communists mean. But it's a danger if there isn't a clarification there that actually some of these populist right narratives will win out. People say, oh, it's kind of good because we're going to get back to our free democracy, or because the Israelis won't be occupying the government, or any one of these narratives. But we have to be square. The end of the empire is good because the main enemy, or at least the weakening of the empire is good, because the main enemy of the people of this country, the US ruling class, is losing strength, is losing power. And that makes our task here to make revolution a bit easier. I'm not saying it's an easy task by any means, but it creates openings. I don't know if you have any more on this point.
Yeah, I have a little more. This can also be somewhat illustrated by the period of neoliberalism, where after the defeat of the Chinese Revolution and the implementation of capitalism in China, the US starting to defeat the Soviet Union and basically being in a much strengthened position worldwide. Across the Western world and the allies of the US, you saw austerity and brutal cuts to all kinds of welfare. You saw as the empire grew stronger, any kind of opposition was beat down, they were able to exploit even harder. So I think this underlines the point that our interests are not aligned with the military interests of our oppressors. That's what I have said.
Fantastic point. So this transitions into our second point to discuss a little bit, which is the future of the US empire. Now, people may be aware before this war even started, Tucker was saying basically that the US needs to accept that it's no longer a world power, that it's one of a number of great powers in the world, and that the US needed to accept a redivision of the world, with China in particular, and to come to some sort of power sharing agreement. He put this out in his episode right before the war. And Tucker is important because he's the most popular figure in conservative media. Trump called him a low IQ person because of this. But it's a more objective view amongst the US bourgeoisie. It's a view Kissinger repeatedly put forward before he died. It's a view that some section of the US bourgeoisie who advocated changes like the Great Reset through the World Economic Forum were advocating. They're saying, let's find some way to kind of redivide the share. China needs a bigger slice. Everyone knows that. We got to figure out who's going to be losing a little bit of money. No one wants to lose the money. They can't agree on the plan. And so now there's war. But the question that arises from this really is what is the status of the US coming out of this war with Iran, when it does end, if it does end soon, and also with the breakup of NATO, or not full breakup, but potential dissolution of NATO, and the U.S. EU changes, the changes in that relationship. And the reality is, as I noted earlier, U.S. military deterrence, at least in the Middle East, but I think also in East Asia, no longer exists. Iran has shown that they are more than capable of facing all the might the U.S. has to throw at them, short of nukes, and they stood in the face of a nuclear threat. Trump said, we'll annihilate the whole civilization. And they said, give it a shot, go ahead. And then Trump blinked and went to negotiate. So it's hard to understate what that has done to U.S. military deterrence worldwide. As Karl noted, the U.S. has also cannibalized the resources, the munition stockpiles of the empire, the missiles, the air defense systems, the radar. The U.S. ruling class, as I see it, will have to book a major strategic retreat from the Middle East. I don't think there's any real future for Israel as a country in the 5-year mark, maybe sooner. And there's a real possibility that the US loses not just the Middle East, but a significant portion of East Asia and becomes reduced to a hemispheric power that is largely confined to the Western Hemisphere with investment and trade abroad, but nothing like the 800 military bases, dominance of global strategic lanes of communication through a giant blue water navy, and so on. That is a huge, huge, huge thing and a very hard pill for the US ruling class to swallow if that's on the table. In the face of this, many of them will reject it. And the Trump administration seems intent on rejecting it. But then you have to ask the question, if some see it, including some in the military, this war is losing, and Trump and the executive, or at least some section of it, are charging forward, then the question arises, namely, will they try to assassinate him? And it's a serious question. We have to take it seriously. Engels, in his discussion of the foreign policy of Russian Tsardom, noted how the Russian spy services and intelligence agencies in the 19th century assassinated at least one Tsar. They did this because the Tsar was going off the rails and wasn't following the policies that they thought was the most objective to expand the Tsarist empire. If Trump doubles and triples down on this thing, talks about himself as the Messiah, as he's been basically doing, alienates basically everyone in his base except for the hardcore rabid Zionists, then there's a real question, and it's a serious thing there, I think is being considered, to be frank, at the top levels of the intelligence service and the military if they should assassinate Trump. Evidence for this is clear in the fact that a large number of generals and top-ranking officials in the Pentagon have been forced to resign since the start of this war. There's major conflict playing out in the military. Tucker is a spokesperson in a certain sense for a section of the intelligence service and the bourgeoisie, and he's coming out very hard against Trump. Each episode he puts out is more and more critical of Trump. So the assassination, I think, is a very realistic possibility. And then there's nothing, as they see with the Kennedy assassination, like a presidential assassination to unite the country, and then also to basically bring out a bunch of new domestic repression, which the US ruling class wants. I want to speak more on this question of the US retreat to the hemispheric power, potentially, but I want to pass it to Karl briefly first. I saw you.
Yeah, no, a major problem with that is, of course, then J.D. Vance will be president, which is, he recently spoke at TP USA for like half-empty room and having basically possibly being excommunicated by the Pope. But I was actually looking to transition to the next one. But so if you have more to add on this one,
I want to say a couple more things. Yeah, so I just want to spell this out. It's a big question in the face of such a collapse if the US ruling class could manage it. Because the type of fall of a global empire that we're talking about being within the realm of possibility. I'm not saying it's the most likely outcome, but it's very much within the realm of possibility if the US doubles down on mistake after mistake here, would lead to a type of economic and social dislocation last seen with the fall of the Soviet Union. When the leaders of the Soviet Union tried to manage decline and failed at it, and they saw their empire crumble, and by that point the Soviet Union was a capitalist and imperialist power, when they saw their empire crumble, the mafia basically took over the country. The system of currency exchange broke down, at least in the rural areas of Russia. People were not using the currency, they were using moonshine as the basic currency, and the population growth collapsed. The life expectancy plummeted. There was years of basically lost economic growth and development. And I'm not talking about just years of losses of profits, but I mean incredible economic and social hardship for the people. And in a certain sense, you know, Russia, in certain ways, economically and militarily has recovered, but you can still see the cultural scars from that period very much in Russian daily life today. And that's assuming that the US bourgeoisie is relatively competent and can manage something like Putin pulled off, which is eventually to get the big oligarchs and mafiosos in line, bring them to heel, and unite the ruling class around a shared vision. There's a possibility of a kind of spiral here out, which wouldn't be a 1-year spiral or a 2-year spiral, or even a 5 or 10-year spiral, but where they just really can't manage much more of an empire, and they end up kind of more reduced to the status of something like Britain, but much quicker. And remember, British power was preserved after they lost most of their colonies because it was advantageous for the US to preserve the British as a key ally in Europe and around the world. But if the US loses out to China and to Russia, and a bunch of the European powers turn to side with China and Russia, and Iran becomes a major power in the region, and all the Gulf countries, either the UAE ceases to exist, or the Saudis flip to be, you know, for Iran, and Israel's gone, and Turkey gobbles up some stuff. That scale of collapse is, we're actually talking greater than the collapse of the Soviet Union in terms of economic and political fall. And a lot of very, very intense problems arise from there, but also big potential revolutionary crises in this country. And I want to be square briefly, and we're going to touch on this a little more at the end, what that means for communists. To put it bluntly, if the US enters something of a death spiral, or even just faces a major catastrophic collapse of its global empire, and the ruling class isn't able to manage it well, we've got to get our shit together. I mean, the tasks that will be in front of us, that will be important not only for the people of this country, but the people of the world, are monumental. And if we are not able to constitute ourselves as a powerful force and link up with the advanced section of the working class and the popular masses, then we will miss one of the greatest opportunities that's existed for revolutionaries in the last 100 years, if not the history of capitalism itself. So we have some very, very hard work in front of us. But more on that later.
Yes, and to connect this question of the US pulling from basically large parts of the world and going through a major crisis, of course, this cannot be without having very fundamental effects on Europe. So basically, Europe was already before this crisis very poorly positioned to be able to continue being an imperialist world power and to compete with the other major imperialist powers. It's even debatable whether or not the EU was a proper world power considering the low level of unity. It's more a loose group of powers. To say it bluntly, Europe is weak, extremely bureaucratic, and disunited. And on top of that, Europe is inferior to Russia, both in a nuclear sense specifically and generally militarily. Russia is winning in Ukraine, and as we stated earlier, politicians are basically openly stating this now. In the beginning of the war, we were told that it was entirely possible for them to go entirely all the way to Moscow and liberate all of Russia in some kind of way. But this was, of course, just a lie. It was really with the plan to bleed Russia. But now we stand with a much stronger Russia at the end of this war, and basically Europe having no out other than to postpone the end of the war a little bit, while generations of Ukrainians are wiped out. The defeat of Ukraine is going to mean that Russia is going to gain control not only over Ukraine, but many of their previous dependent countries in the Eastern Europe, and will have to be reintegrated into the European political and economic system, which will require major concessions from the European countries, no matter what they subjectively want. They simply don't have the military to fight them and win. Some might think that Trump's blatant aggression and issues like the invasion of Ukraine and this Iran war, making Europe take a common stand on international issues, will make Europe suddenly more united and finally get their shit together and unite as a power. But in reality, these kind of external circumstances cannot fundamentally change the problems that Europe is facing. Europe has been unable to centralize, not because of subjective ideological problems or disagreements over relations to the US or Russia. The main problem is that Europe is made up of a mosaic of feudal fiefdoms of capitalist countries where different local capitalist classes have ingrained interests in their individual particular capitalist systems. And for them to integrate requires a centralized force being able to force them to. Something much, much greater than just some external pressure. So while they might be taking a more united stand now against Trump or Russia to some degree, in reality, Europe is really in a position where they are easily divided, easily split against each other, and the centralization needed for them to advance as an imperialist power and to compete against the other forces is greatly falling. The US was already pulling troops, resources, and support for European military projects out of Europe before this. But of course, the US military might be shown to be a literal paper, not literally, but a paper tiger. The US pulling out militarily from Europe is going to have a very deep and sincere effect on the relation of forces in Europe. Basically, the Europe is going to have to accept Russian integration, and yeah, there you go.
Yeah, we can see here this image behind us they put out for this talking point. It says, okay, they're going to make mega mergers. Wow, mega mergers of giant corporations to compete with the US and China. Well, like Karl just said, who's going to eat the loss? Which section of European capital will no longer be in control? Even if they make some money, they won't be in control anymore. They haven't been able to resolve these contradictions for 20 years more. The reality is that there was a fairly systematic plan drawn up a couple years ago by the former head of the European Central Bank, Mario Draghi. This was done at the behest of the European Commission to plan out how Europe could maintain competitive viability and strategic autonomy with capital from the US and China. The answer was an immediate and united effort without delay to invest 600 plus billion euros a year to renovate European energy and manufacturing. Basically, none of that has happened. The Commission came with this report. It was pretty comprehensive. I think it was fairly objective. I read it. It was a few hundred pages. And basically, the most simple political divides in the Eurozone prevented it from being implemented almost at all. And there's just no way. I mean, you all saw the graph earlier that Karl pulled up. It had the gap between China and the US on economic and military matters and so on. And then the entirety of the Eurozone was there, less than the US. And that's not a unified bloc. So there's no way that the EU can compete globally. But I want to ask you, Karl, do you think, because there's some people who say, okay, Europe's not really quite even a second-rate power. Well, does this mean that they're kind of a third-rate power now? What's the future? Fourth-rate power? Like weak group of local states with some specialized manufacturing? Like what is the future here?
Yeah, I think when we see the discussions going on between China and Spain, and actually you notice China more recently, they're kind of changing their rhetoric from speaking about each power having their own zone and they have to kind of a might makes right logic. They're starting to actually speak in the language of multilateralism and international law. They're presenting themselves as the defender of the UN-led international system rhetorically. And I think this is a way to reach out to some of these European nations who are hoping to retain their position. But the question is, will China actually accept Europe as a second-rate power in their new world system? Does China need Europe in the same way that the US needed Europe against the Soviet Union? You got to remember, after World War II, the US was facing a third of the world that was controlled by communist, socialist parties that were actively, to some degree, fighting against imperialism. So now with US basically possibly being put in a situation where they're going to pull out of many parts of the world, is China and Russia really going to face the kind of opposition that makes them need to give Europe a position in this system? I'm not saying Europe will be completely destroyed, but basically the relations of forces is in such a way that it's only natural according to the logic of predatory capitalist imperialism that Europe is going to be played out against each other, carved up, and their markets and their overall control over their colonies in Africa and surrounding nations is going to be carved up and divided between Russia and China. So in reality, I believe that Europe will become a third-rate power or even a fourth-rate, whatever that means. So in this way, a wise comrade illustratively said to me the other day, EU is on the menu.
So yeah, that I think sums it up very well. This brings us to our kind of concluding point, which is this quote once again from Mao. And I actually want to start by asking you, we talked last fall about this question, and the thought was, okay, given the disorder brewing in the system, which things have proceeded, I think, faster than either of us thought with this war and everything playing out, what are the prospects for advances in Europe? Because at the time, we talked about how Europe and the EU was one of the weaker links in the imperialist system. Not like the weak link in the sense of like an oppressed country that's being attacked by imperialism, but like clearly the weakest center of imperialist powers compared to Russia, China, and the US. So what does all this turmoil and change in the EU being on the menu, what does this mean for revolutionary developments in Denmark specifically and in the EU more broadly?
Overall, this is very much an exciting development, not in the sense that we should be happy that people's conditions are going to be worse, but basically that the destruction of the current system and the EU being put in this kind of position means serious openings for revolutionaries in Europe in a way that hasn't existed for a long time. In Europe, basically the stability offered through the US-led system has led to a point where, similar to America, people are oppressed, they're exploited, their labor is being plundered from them, and there's great social inequality, there's great suffering, but it's just to a level where people aren't forced to rise up. And basically, there also exists, particularly among many of the petty bourgeois intellectuals or the more, you can say, well-off strata of the population, a group which, while their conditions and actual possibilities for the future has greatly worsened, they still support the existing system because they still somewhat benefit from it. But this is going away, and there's going to be a much broader, much broader group of people within many European countries, even countries like Denmark, where you have the welfare state, but it's kind of crumbling and falling apart, that are going to rise and basically be mobilized by this kind of thing. So while the international powers and the imperialists are dividing up the world, splitting, fighting against each other, there's new openings for working class movements to unite across borders and start struggling and establishing themselves in these countries.
Yeah, that's well said. And I think the basic perspective you're laying out there is the fundamental one communists have to take up, which is the situation is very challenging, but the openings that lay in front of us are tremendous. It was only in times of turmoil historically, or it has been only in times of turmoil historically, that there's been actually large and mass rallying away from the political apathy that is so typical of imperialist society and to a revolutionary politics, and in particular to communist politics, capable of really ultimately defeating the bourgeoisie as a class. I'm not saying that in the coming months or years we're going to have world communist revolution. I want to be squared. The communist forces globally right now are quite weak. But it's been in periods of turmoil like the one which we have already entered, which is just beginning, that revolutionary forces, and communist forces in particular, have been able to grow significantly. The last 50 years of reaction, of neoliberal austerity, of pacification in the imperialist centers has done tremendous damage to the communist movement, to the working class movement, and to the popular masses, both economically, in terms of their daily lives, but also ideologically. I mean, think about what it is to be a critical thinking person, to be an intellectual, to have some real sense of the problems in the world, even if confused, to have some ability to independently research, some time on your hands in an imperialist country, to independently research some of what's going on, and to say, you know what, this brutal system, it keeps me a little bit safer. I mean, what sort of person do you have to be to really come to terms with that? To think, maybe this is the best we can do as humans. A system that sends millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions to an early grave. I'm not just talking about those who die in wars or from sanctions. I used to live in Boston. In Boston, there's a road that runs through it, Massachusetts Avenue. On the north of Mass Ave is the gentrified section of the city. To the south of it is Roxbury, a predominantly Black and Hispanic neighborhood that has not yet been gentrified, although that's happened over the last few years a bit. When you cross Mass Ave, the life expectancy drops 30 years in a major city in an imperialist country. 30 years. That's 30 years, probably 1/3 or more of most people's lives, robbed from them. From stress, malnutrition, poverty, poor housing, police violence, etc. What does it mean to make our peace with that system? And if we can really see how brutal that logic is, we have a sense of what an alternative is needed. But also, in peacetime, it's easy enough for a lot of intellectuals, even leftists, to sort of feel an apathetic peace with the system. They may hate it, they may complain about the oppression, but to not really actually think about, what do I need to do daily to bring people together to fight to transform the world? But in times of crisis, when it's in your face, it's not some statistic that you heard about life expectancy. It's not something happening in a faraway place. I mean, 12-hour plane ride is not so far, but a faraway place like Iraq or Afghanistan or Yemen or Palestine. But it's right in front of us, all around us, every time we look at the phone and social media, every time you turn on the TV. In those situations, decisions are more clearly forced upon people, as you were referring to earlier. And in those conditions, it's possible, not inevitable, and our victory is by no means guaranteed, but it's possible to rally a large section of the population to the pole of revolution. But it's only possible if we study the lessons of revolutionary history, if we look back at the past successes and failures, and there was a lot of successes, but there were also some real failures and defeats. If we replicate the successes and we avoid repeating the mistakes, if we break from our existing sectarianism so prevalent on the US left and find ways to actually build a strong united force, if we break from the social isolation so common on the left and link up with the working class and not just have little intellectual leftist spaces, if we break from the bourgeois domination of the working class movement through their, the union leadership, which is so corrupt and blatantly pro-capitalist in this country. And these are just a few of the tasks that lay in front of us. But I want to make it a little more concrete for you than just speak of vaguely openings. And hopefully this helps to clarify again the type of historic opening that we will have in front of us in the coming years. An opening that we can't squander. An opening that calls upon us, that demands of us, if we hope to really try to change the world, if we in any sense can call ourselves Marxists or communists or revolutionaries, to take every last minute we have to study, to organize, to fight, to improve our abilities, to seize the time, as the Panthers said, to seize the time that's in front of us. Because we've just lived through 50 years of stagnation, 50 years of reaction. We can understand that these opportunities do not come around every week or month or year. These are quite literally once-in-a-lifetime openings for the people of this country and the people of the world. And I'll just say, it is a duty we have to ourselves, to those we care about, to the people of this country, but to the people of the world. Because the future that the capitalists will have in store for us if we don't get our shit together is very grim. I mean, can you imagine what the sort of people like Peter Thiel and Elon Musk and Bill Gates will do? Given what we know what they do, a little bit of what they do from the Epstein files, what will they do to hold on to power? Not when they have power. What sort of atrocities will they unleash upon the world to hold on to power? If we cannot not only put a check on them by getting our act together, but also organize to overthrow the capitalist class. So sort of a somber note, but I think that's the weight of the situation. I don't know if you have more you want to add. Okay, any concluding remarks?
It's important to remember that between the Paris Commune and the October Revolution, there was almost 50 years. It's nothing unnatural or unheard of in history that there are long periods of darkness and reaction. It's it can be difficult becoming a revolutionary in this kind of period to break from the idea that nothing's ever going to change and that everything's going to stay the same. Not even if you're a revolutionary. I think most people think that way. I think most people fundamentally believe that nothing is going to change. But ultimately, reality and the facts are going to come into conflict with that. If you were born in the middle, in the 30s, in the middle of the Great Depression, you would have gotten to see World War II, the creation of the East Bloc, the anti-colonial struggles, the near victory of the world communist movement, the defeat, wars to reshape the world over and over again, and lives of normal people looking completely different within a single lifetime. It's unimaginable. And to say to such a person that the world stays the same, I mean, it's young naivety, or maybe There's some other people that believe it too. But,
Cynicism then.
Yeah, cynicism. But I think it's time we prepare for the changes and seize the moment to make a better future for the working class and mankind.
Thank you all. So we'll do Q&A now. We'll take questions probably in a batch of like 3 people. We'll go one at a time, but I'll call on 3 people. We'll go through in order. You can have a question for both of us. For one of us, we may both answer anyways, but yeah. All right, so questions? You can go first. So just for the recording, so that people can hear who are going to watch this later, I'll repeat the questions. So the question was, we talked about the EU becoming a 3rd or 4th rate power, but what are the possibilities of the dissolution of the EU, given the current turmoil? What would that mean for the people of Europe and the people of the world? I don't know if you want to answer first.
Sure. I think when we talk about Europe becoming a 3rd-rate power, first of all, it means that the powers within Europe will become a 3rd-rate power. Whether or not the EU will exist, that doesn't really fundamentally change the fact that the imperialist powers within Europe, France, Germany, Spain, Denmark, these countries are in a dire situation. Whether or not the EU will be able to continue to exist, I believe it will for some time, although it depends on which forms the reintegration of Russia into the European system will take. I think it's not something that we can necessarily predict right now, but a transformation of the EU will definitely be necessary for it to continue to exist if the European powers are not a world power anymore. So it can become kind of a loose affiliation or continue to be.
Yeah, that's well said. I'll just add a few things. Building off what you said about the EU will change its form. I mean, it's entirely possible the EU continues to exist. It could be dissolved too, but if it continues to exist, but Russia joins the EU and plays a largely dominant role in it, and then a section of countries are very closely aligned with China, and France loses most of its Western African colonies or neo-colonies, they're somewhere between the two with France Afrique, to Russia and to China. And Germany increasingly has to basically lose its auto industry and has to accept kind of a role as a Mittelstand for Chinese economy and not as an industrial powerhouse. Whatever form the EU takes then will be almost unrecognizable compared to what it's been today. And that may be, in the end, the best case scenario for the European bourgeoisie, the various bourgeoisies there. It could easily be torn apart, and even there could be potentially some wars that break out over this. It's not out of the realm possibility. I mean, German rearmament is not just to fight Russia, but potentially to secure, control of the European markets from even France, maybe. I mean, that isn't on the immediate table, but there's some real possibilities there, or Britain, or so on. My point is not to say those things are the most likely outcome, but rather that when you have the whole world order falling apart, and as Erdogan put it, like the might makes right type approach, the old alliances can mean very little, actually, especially if there's just a good deal of chaos. Yeah, a lot can change. And again, I don't think Germany fighting France is the most likely thing in the short term or anything like that, but it could really be a carving up of the EU and its end as an entity as well. So the question, I think, is twofold, and I'll break it into 2, and then we can respond. The first is, okay, does the analysis of the openings from the Iran war and the potential end of NATO, talking about that as a future thing, cover over the openings that already exist today? And then in particular, does it cover over, and we can deal with this somewhat related, but also somewhat separately, the dangers of the populist right and even proto-fascist movements that have sprung up around the world in opposition to the liberal order, which present themselves as something of a people-centered alternative, or something like, oh, this is for the Palestinian people, or for draining the swamp, like we saw with Trump. I'm just roughly paraphrasing some of the points you made. So those are kind of the 2 questions as I see it. I'll just start by answering. I don't think the analysis is saying wait for the crisis and then act. The goal of this analysis is to spell out the shitstorm that already exists. Hence the emphasis that Karl had about the Polycrisis predating this war. This whole crisis that's brought about actually is the result of an objective conflict between social and class forces. Various imperialist powers coming to a head, trying to control their own domestic population, regional powers, and different forces, and so on. There's been a series of, I think, miscalculations by the US ruling class, which have accelerated its decline, but this crisis exists objectively. You also spoke earlier to the 10-year cycle. All of this in the 50-year cycle, all of this leads to the discrediting of the liberal order. So I don't think in any way we're advocating wait for these openings then act. We certainly have to seize the time now. But we also need to be square the nature of the current developments and the intensification of certain contradictions actually is drastically changing the situation globally and domestically in various countries at a qualitative level. A level which is hard to grasp at the present, accustomed as we are to the decades of relative stability and peacetime under imperialism. So there's also actually an urgency to clarify to the people here in attendance and more broadly, the nature of the changes that are taking place. Because if we do not grasp these, we will miss the openings that are arising. And so it's actually a duty we have. And it's part of what the concrete is, actually. It's not just what's immediately right in front of us. Actually, the concrete is the unity of the general and the particular. And we can say, okay, what's empirically in front of us? And certainly people like Tommy Robinson and others are in front of us. But also what's in front of us and what can be grasped actually by abstracting from what's in front of us is the movement of certain contradictions on a global scale and a national scale that are leading to drastic changes. The phenomena of which are only starting to emerge, $286 a barrel oil, etc. That's the beginning, not the end of these developments. I'll respond to the other points around dealing with the populist right in a second, but I want to see if you want to.
No, we can transition into the one on the populist right. So overall, yes, to answer, in Denmark, we have also had some developments towards the populist right, but it has been somewhat muted by the main center-left parties just adopting the far-right policies on immigration. And then, they say, we need to defend the international law on human rights, while they say we need to get exemptions from human rights for our immigration policy. So that's a great sell there. But basically, yes, while these worsening conditions can also form the basis of ultra-reactionary movements, and the bourgeoisie will in fact try to promote these kinds of movements as a counterforce to the working class and mass struggles that are going to be possible through this situation. It's of a fundamentally different character, and while there has been some economic pain, it's also important to understand that these reactionary movements don't just arise like automatically from the situation becoming economically worse. While it can be related to that, it's usually very concretely bourgeois forces within these countries promoting them and developing them. And the only way to resist that is active organization of the masses and the workers. So that's why we're saying these openings exist.
Yeah. In terms of the point you make about the dangers and actually the subtleties of how various populist right and proto-fascist groups work and how they gain popularity, it's a key point. And while I disagree with some of your first point, I think this point is essential. In America, we're so conditioned with the Hollywood depiction of the Nazis. Not that the Nazis didn't do a bunch of fucked up stuff, and not that some of them weren't cartoonishly evil, but it's almost depicted as if the Nazis' mass appeal was simply them saying, ooh, let's do evil stuff. And everyone's like, yes, great, let's do evil stuff. I've been waiting for my chance to mass murder. This is pretty far from the reality of how the Nazi Party actually rose and got its power. I would highly recommend that basically every US revolutionary read in its entirety a book by Jan Myrdal, a Swedish Maoist author. He passed a few years ago, India Waits. But in particular, in the introduction to it, he explains he was a young anti-fascist youth in the 40s in Sweden. The challenges, he explains these challenges that him and other anti-fascist youth had in dealing with the propaganda put forward by the pro-Nazi youth. Because what they did, the Nazi youth, is they said, Look at the crimes of British imperialism. They said, here's a pamphlet we wrote on the Bengal famine and how the British are killing so many Indians in Bengal. We need to unite, the fascists said this, against Anglo-American imperialism. They handed out leaflets saying, unite against Anglo-American imperialism. And they were able to rally a decent amount of people around this line. And there were some weaknesses actually in the official Comintern parties in not discussing the Bengal famine and in the line they took on India, which actually weakened the ability of the anti-fascist movement to effectively fight this sort of stuff. Jan Myrdal talks about in his own youth how disorienting this was, but also how a section of older communists who were used to doublethink basically just didn't deal with this problem. We can't repeat those mistakes. While many communists in the Second World War fought very heroically against the fascist movement, there was also a good deal of mistakes that were made in combating the rise of fascism by the communists specifically. And to say one does not deny the other's reality. We have to learn from those mistakes specifically, because you're absolutely right to note that the way that they get popular appeal and credibility right now is through opposing the hypocrisy and oppression of the liberal order. And the typical response of a lot of liberals is to say, oh, how terrible, the rightists opposing, liberalism, and fail to grasp the kernels of correct criticism that these far-right people are putting forward about how the liberal order screwed over so many people. People may have seen some of Louis Theroux's newest documentary where he goes and talks to manosphere influencers. And basically what they all say to him is well, what's your stand on Palestine? These are guys, some of them who are basically openly pro-Hitler. But then well, you're supporting genocide in Palestine, Louis Theroux, you BBC journalist or whatever. Fuck you, you suck, you're a hypocrite, we don't believe a word you say. And this liberal journalist struggles to respond to it because it's his whole worldview is pretty warped and so on. We need to do better than Louis Theroux, which is a low bar. But if we fail to do better than that sort of false liberal opposition to the far right, which is somewhat of a real opposition, but it's not a real class-based opposition, ultimately we will not only fail to oppose the rise of the far right, we'll play into it. And if you look right now at what's happening in US media, there's a tremendous push to promote, various forms of far-right thinking, even about Israel, to basically say, oh, this is Zionist occupation of the government, and promote all this sort of anti-Semitism, to explain away all the complexities of the US-Israel dynamics with long, actually centuries, millennia old stereotypes about Jewish people, and to bring those out and, attack, take criticism of Israel, real criticism of Israel, and funnel it into something that's totally harmless for the capitalist system. So that's a very real danger right now. In the back, you had a question? Yeah, fantastic question. I'll pull up the slide actually so we can see the quote again. The question was, given this Lenin quote about the redivision of the world, how does this tie to the redivision of Europe and the Marshall Plan after World War II and all the other stuff? And then how does this tie to various structures that are set up after these wars in peacetime to handle the contradictions between the powers? So Lenin's point here is inevitably, as Karl noted, because of the differential rates of growth that exist amongst the capitalist powers, the division of the world that exists at a given time between them, their control over colonies and markets and labor, will not change while their relative strength changes. One country like China will advance its production, its capital accumulation, its defense capabilities, etc. But that change domestically in China, its advancing production relative to the US, does not automatically lead to a reconfiguration of the control of the loot and plunder of the world. So what you have is, with the rising powers, suddenly they're getting close to, or maybe even exceeding, the powers of the old imperialist powers. And those rising powers then say, hey, we have so much wealth and capital at our disposal. By this law of might makes right, we should have a greater share of the world's plunder. But the old system of colonial domination, or in the present era of the Bretton Woods and NATO and the EU, and all that stuff still exists. And therefore, the spoils of the world are not presently divided according to the disparity in the powers. And so, the argument is that the only way to resolve this contradiction between the changes in the relative strengths and the stability of the colonial and neo-colonial holdings is ultimately through war.
Yeah, and to add, the institution established after World War II were established through war. It was the World War and the redivision of the world that happened militarily through that war that enabled the creation of these institutions. It was the objective might and relative strength of the capitalist nations which was formalized and turned into a system that sticks around by that. But the power was created through war, the actual division. So in that way, maybe that clarifies it.
Yeah, and a unique thing actually about the post-World War II order was the establishment of the system of neocolonialism, where instead of each colony being an exclusive or relatively exclusive domain of a single imperialist power, the colonies were basically kept open by the US primarily, as the world policeman, for the joint exploitation by the imperialist powers. So everyone could, invest in these colonies to one degree or another, and there were certain rules of engagement, and the US kept things open for plunder, and if there was like a rebel movement, the US labeled them terrorists and killed them or whatever. Sometimes with French air support, or sometimes the French troops were sent, or sometimes UN peacekeeping troops were sent. And this allowed for a little bit more flexibility because countries could gain a little market share there, lose a little market share here, but the whole system wasn't challenged. But that system was built on the US being the world policeman. As soon as there's a proper peer competitor to the US that's within the system, it falls apart. And so when the Soviet Union had the restoration of capitalism, there was basically two systems: the Bretton Woods system under US leadership and then the Soviet-led system, Comecon. Not Comic-Con, Com-Econ. A common confusion. And these two systems basically were parallel. There was very little interaction between them economically. With the fall of the Soviet Union, everyone was unified under basically what's called Bretton Woods II, which is the semi-informal system that replaced Bretton Woods in the 70s. And within that system, one unified imperialist system for the entire world, we've seen the emergence of China as a rival competitor. This system cannot sustain two poles within it. And so there has to be war to redivide the world. Whether this will take the form of wars like the Iran War and proxy wars between the US and China, or whether it will take the form of a world war is an open question. What we saw with the collapse of the Soviet Union was that the leaders of the Soviet Union basically were very hesitant to go to world war because they believed it would lead to the thermonuclear annihilation of the world. And they tried to basically have a managed retreat of their power and empire globally, which ended up turning into a full-scale collapse. The US ruling class, when they're talking about Armageddon and Trump being the second coming, may well go for world war. It's uncertain. But either way, wars of one scale or another are needed to redivide the world. So hopefully that clarifies. Okay, we'll take a few more questions. I see 1, 2, and 3. And we'll get to you afterwards. So go ahead. It's a great question.
Restate the question.
Yeah, I'll restate it. The question is basically, given the fact that the populist right is gaining some ground actually right now, and for example, the Tucker Carlson type of Christian articulation is growing in popularity and pulling some people, actually a significant number of people, away from the typical kind of Christian Zionism, evangelical stuff. How do we get the people who are subscribing to Tucker now to pull away from that and become actually communists? It's a central question, actually. It's one we in MCU have been grappling with for a number of years. And actually, initially, when we put the stuff forward that, hey, there's this populist right thing, it's not just reducible to fascism and so on, a lot of liberal groups or even leftist groups freaked out and said, oh, you're just supporting fascism and so on. And actually, I think we've been proven right. And what's been shown is the people who had that confusion were far too sympathetic to liberalism and saw communism as sort of a more left version of liberalism, which is not uncommon in times of reaction and so on. But the basic answer is you have to be able to explain in vivid color through numerous examples all the different issues that arise in the society from a communist perspective in a way that can reach these people. And I think we've had some modest success in doing this as MCU. If you look at our social media posts, especially some of our Instagram reels and stuff, you'll see a lot of comments on there. People say, great analysis, except I think communism's bad. Great analysis. I don't know about the whole Maoism thing, though. That's weird, you know? Now, our social media presence, a lot of it is specifically aimed at people who are already really looking for a Marxist analysis. But I think what we see is that with the Epstein files, with the Iran war, with the defeat, kind of internal defeat of MAGA and the discrediting of it, there's a huge number of people who kind of saw some of this populist right stuff, initially Trump 1 and Trump 2, as a hope, as a solution to the problems, are now desperately trying to find a better answer. And it's in this period of ideological instability and crisis that communists can reach them. Not if we say, hey, you know, just read Capital. Not if we just say, we're against the bourgeoisie. I mean, we should have people read Capital. We should clarify we're against the bourgeoisie. But we need to show them concretely, actually, how Marxism and Marxist analysis can explain all the issues of the day. Epstein's promotion of microtransactions in video games. You know, the... I don't know, I'm trying to think of a few of these topics. Oh, the statement by the CEO of BlackRock that DEI was a failed experiment. You know, a huge number of people got kind of fed up with the absurdity of DEI and postmodern liberal identity politics and went to right-wing stuff. Not because they're committed rightists or because they hate women or black people or anything, but just because they're like, wait, this doesn't make sense. This is corporate HR speak. And then they got the CEO of BlackRock saying, it's all a fucking failed experiment. We tried it, we gave up on it. I mean, how much better of an exposure can you have than that? We have to take advantage of these openings. And this comes back to what Lenin said in What Is to Be Done, that in order to develop the class consciousness of the proletariat, it's not enough to talk about their economic conditions. It's not enough to talk about and unite them in the union struggle. You have to explain every instance in the society and every form of oppression of every class, group, and strata from a proletarian perspective. And so we had a video or a comment on our reel just to capture it. It said, you know, basically, I like your videos, but I don't agree with communism. And it was like his shirt or his profile was like Muslim father. That was his two things he had on his profile. So, okay, you get a sense. He's not a Tucker Carlson type, but he's someone who might look to a kind of religious populism who's coming across what we're putting out. To be clear, we've got a lot to learn and a lot of work to do to make this happen. But I think that shows some elements of what success looks like there.
I don't have anything to add on this one.
Next question, I think. Thank you. I'll reiterate, and then if you want to say, and then I'll go. So there's a lot you said, but I think you noted the urgency of us Marxists uniting and getting to the working class, winning them over, and showing them the fact that actually they're worsening conditions, especially as the U.S. imperialists are preparing for war and launching new attacks, that their worsening condition is because of U.S. imperialism. And you noted, and I think totally correctly, that a huge reason for the rise in the populist right and its popularity amongst the working class is because of the historic betrayal of the Social Democrats and the union leaders. So, Karl, if you want to start.
Yeah. And since we're in New York City, I think that speaks to why supporting Soran as a stopping block for stopping this fascism is not going to work. Because it's actually this type of politics which in the long run has led to so many among the masses becoming disgruntled. And this actually is very relevant in Denmark too, where the Social Democratic Party and their affiliates have been promoting this type of politics among the working class, and has basically led to a point where the vast majority of the working class don't identify with the unions or with the left in general, and that there's a great pessimism about the ability to change things through united struggle. So this type of, we can vote someone in who's going to solve our problems for us. This is a logic which pacifizes the working class and the masses, and it actually paves the way for fascism.
As for, I agree with what you said, and I think also the failures of social democracy to achieve anything meaningful for the working class are typified by the Danish model, where you have this extremely high union density and all these Social Democratic Party politicians in office for decades and decades, century almost. And the conditions for workers, has not meaningfully improved. And now you have all these kind of scab unions come in and kind of driving out the existing unions, and the Social Democratic politicians are kind of making their peace with that to one degree or another. I mean, it shows, like, even at its most intense, the social democracy thing, it's still capitalism and can't resolve the basic problems for people. I want to actually focus on a smaller point you said, since I think Karl covered most of it very well, that the key task for us right now is to carry on this form of economic agitation amongst the working class. I think it's absolutely essential that we do it, and we clarify to the workers the basis of their economic woes being the capitalist system. But I don't agree that that is actually our main task as Marxists. I think it's a mistake to say this. I'm not discounting the importance of doing so. No Marxist movement can win the working class over without carrying on economic agitation amongst the workers, and without ultimately showing the basis for Marxist leadership of the working class struggle and leading those struggles successfully. But if you look at the history of development of the Russian Marxist movement, you have a series of periods of their development. The earliest stage, the key task, was actually the development of the workers' study circles to train the advanced workers in Marxism, so that those workers could then go make ties amongst other workers and build up a base for the not yet party. Then you had to travel from these study circles of workers and revolutionaries to carrying on mass agitation, which was some of it economic, but also political agitation. And historically, there arose, after Lenin's imprisonment and exile in Siberia in the late 1890s, a section of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, the Russian Marxist Party, they were called Social Democrats though at the time, for various contingent historical reasons, a section of the party which argued that the economic agitation was the key task. Lenin fought tooth and nail against this. He noted over and over again, of course, economic agitation is very important, but the key thing to really winning workers over to Marxist leadership actually has to be the political agitation, the teaching the workers to understand all the issues in society from a proletarian perspective. That's how class consciousness gets raised beyond trade union consciousness. And this is ultimately summarized in what is to be done. So I, of course, agree we need to carry on broad economic agitation. Without it, there's no way to lead the working class economic struggles. But in doing so, if we don't get beyond that, we end up falling into a trap, a dead end of basically a militant trade unionism, which we've seen time and time again, actually ends up being reabsorbable by the bourgeois system, because militant trade unionism is not yet class-conscious politics. Lenin says it's the form that bourgeois politics takes in the working class movement, even when the workers fight pitched battles. And that's actually a hard pill to swallow, especially in the US, where we've had 50 years of, basically almost 50 years of toothless unionism with an occasional militant flare-up that then the union leaders basically work to crush. But we definitely want more militant union struggles, but that's not enough. And actually then our key task has to be actually the political education of the workers, so that we can develop from the working class itself proletarian intellectuals. Okay, there was a question in the back. I forget who had. So the question is, what is the prospects for a pole distinct from Russia and China emerging, led by Iran, possibly including the other Islamic countries? I want to be clear, because my earlier analysis my statements may have been somewhat misleading. While Turkey may, in a certain sense, join the war on the side of Iran, in the sense they would fight against the Kurdish militias if the US arms them, and the Kurdish forces more broadly, and against Israel, I don't anticipate that there will be anything approaching a durable military alliance between Turkey and Iran. Now, there have been some overtures to this. For example, Soleimani, when he was leading the ISIS campaign, the Iranian general, when he was leading the ISIS campaign, the campaign against ISIS in Iraq, had a series of covert meetings with Turkish leadership, which were brokered by the Muslim Brotherhood, that aimed to establish this sort of alliance, something more durable. these negotiations ultimately failed. I think this was a big reason the U.S. assassinated Soleimani. I think they saw this as a huge threat. It's possible such an alliance, I think tactical could occur, but the actual diverging interests in the region are pretty sharp. Because frankly, Iran has emerged as a third center and will emerge from this war not as strong as Russia, but not so far off in a certain way. And especially if the US, and Britain and the EU seek to do what damage they can to Russia before the war ends, which it seems the way things are going with them blowing up Russian gas terminals and things like that, we could see Iran actually emerge as something of a peer to Russia. I don't say that hyperbolically. Militarily, Iran has fought toe-to-toe and done much better than Russia has done. In terms of the resources and the power in the region, if Iran can consolidate the Suez functionally through Bab el-Mandeb and can consolidate the Persian Gulf, and Dubai goes away, which it will, and the UAE goes away, which it will, and Israel's gone, and the Shia crescent to the Mediterranean is established, and Syria changes hands, and ends up being kind of an Iranian influence, then Iran is a power as big as Russia, if not more. If instead Turkey pushes into the region, it can very much act as something of a limiting factor on Iranian growth because it wants much of the same territory, markets, resources, etc., that Iran is potentially going to get in this war, or from this war, I think likely to get from this war. So I don't see a durable alliance between them.
The only thing I want to add is also, in Syria, the Turkish-backed militias, HTS, have been fighting an ally with the Assad government of Iran. So there clearly is already tensions in the region between them.
Yeah, just to touch on one more aspect, it should be stated, though, the tremendous prestige that Iran has gained globally, but especially in the Islamic world. And the type of regional and global influence they're going to have from this is enormous. It's hard to understate the significance of, at the start of the war, was it in Karachi, I believe it was, the Pakistani embassy, or the US embassy or consulate in Karachi being stormed, and Iranian flags being waved from the top of it. I mean, just look at almost every major Muslim majority city in the world, and you'll see there was some significant mobilization in support of Iran at the start of the war. Things have changed very quickly. And diplomatically, Iran's presence, I think, will be specifically amplified in the region through the alliance it's developed and developing with Oman. Because Oman has been something of the Switzerland of the Middle East for some time and has extremely skilled diplomats. Iran has extremely skilled diplomats, and they have basically all the cards in their hand in the region. So the kind of solidification of the Iran-Omani alliance and the end of the UAE, Qatar being incorporated into Iran, Bahrain being incorporated into Iraq, Iraq emerging as kind of a power under Iran's domination, and probably the fall of the Saudi monarchy, if that does happen. The last one is still more of an if, I think. The others are basically set in stone. Solidify Iran as a huge regional power and as a third power globally, or fourth after the US, China, and Russia. And that's just a fundamental transformation of the world situation. Okay, I saw a question here, one there, one more. One in the back, and we'll do one more. Okay, so I'll do those four. So okay, we'll get five in. Okay, and we'll probably wrap after those five, and then people can mingle.
Okay, I have a question for Karl.
So to rephrase, the question was, what has been the reception of the Iran war in Denmark, and to what degree are people aware of it or reacting to it also among the population and not just the bourgeoisie? Is that somewhat correct? Okay. There's definitely, like on the front of the bourgeoisie, there is some open discussion of it actually. There recently was a debate program held with a few different Danish bourgeois politicians that basically started out with them saying that the NATO alliance was going to be dissolved. And basically two different people saying that it was inevitable. They reeled it in a little bit by starting to suggest, oh, well, maybe we can set up a separate NATO where we just kind of copy the laws and the structures and we just don't have US in there, which is of course a fantasy. Without the US deterrence, what is NATO really in the same way? But there's some open discussion of it. There was also a lot of discussion in that program, for example, about basically the fact that there's not much that Denmark could do about this overall change, and that it was going to have some effect. Of course, I've been in the U.S. for almost a week, but when I spoke to people before that, I felt like people weren't really grasping the situation or the degree to which their lives were going to be affected by it. They were like, "Oh well, it's another war in the Middle East. It seems pretty crazy." You know, they weren't grasping that a lot of things were going to be directly affected, as we've shown here, for them, and that it actually is a fundamentally different world we're standing in within the next month or two. So, or arguably already are. But I believe that, as we're already seeing here, that consciousness is quickly spreading. You see how it is being discussed and all that, and I think even the bourgeoisie will have to deal with this stuff. They will have to put forward a line on it. They will have to put forward some explanations for the disruptions that are going to happen and find a scapegoat, find ways to mobilize people around it. And of course, they're going to have a very difficult time doing that because they're basically still promoting this kind of international law, human rights. We need to return to this the good old days of this system, which of course people know wasn't that good anyway. So if that gives a basic sense of how the sensibilities are.
I think someone, yeah, you had a question. The question is, why should communists kind of not take advantage of certain openings that can exist linguistically to clarify topics? Well, I somewhat have to reject the framing of the question. You noted, okay, like the people know what the Epstein class is, but not the bourgeoisie. Well, there's different contexts to talk about different things. Certainly the term Epstein class, I think, actually has very good, it's not quite a technical term, but it has great, actually, agitational and propaganda value. We should absolutely use it. People understand that by the Epstein class, we mean the section, we can say from the technical perspective, the section of the capitalist class who are involved in the sort of atrocities we know now are common amongst the big bourgeoisie. But we need to be able to speak outside of agitational context with a great deal of precision. Why? Because we need to understand the reality with a great deal of precision to change it. Now look at the case in Russia. When the Marxists started organizing there, do you think anyone knew what the bourgeoisie was? Not really. In fact, the Russian capitalists were a relatively new phenomenon. What's more, literacy rates were what, 10, 12% in the 1880s? What did the Russian Marxists do? They taught the workers. They organized classes. They taught the workers how to read, how to write. They taught them that God didn't exist. They taught them about physics, about evolution, and most of all, they taught them about Marxism. And that was part of how they succeeded. Now, thankfully, there's still some literacy left in the US. So it's a little bit easier for us. We, of course, have to be tactical with how we talk about and use different terms at different points, but we have to teach people because it's not just a small group of communists that changes the world. It's actually the masses that make history. So if we want the masses of people in this country to not just be a force that's dominated by bourgeois society and drudges through everyday life, reproducing the existing society and their own oppression, but for the masses, if we want for the masses to instead become a fighting and conscious force, we have to equip them with the theoretical tools to understand the reality so that they can change it. This is why Lenin says, without revolutionary theory, there can be no revolutionary movement.
Well, I think you covered it pretty well.
Okay,
on this topic. Yeah.
The next one. There was someone in back. There was two people in back, but there was someone kind of over there first. Do you want to answer this one?
I'll go after you.
Okay. The question is Russia's victory in Ukraine really assured? There's some statistics that indicate, including Putin's approval rating falling and this kind of long-standing stalemate on the front lines, that Ukraine that things are maybe not going so well for Russia. First, I'll state that the Russian ruling class clearly overestimated at the start of the war their capabilities. They thought they would quickly win this war. They were wrong. And the conflict has remained relatively stalled out. In this process, we've seen the development of drone warfare, where the new adaptations are developed basically on a monthly level. The meta, so to speak, for drone warfare is changing at that pace. But we see a few key things that indicate the stagnation of the Ukrainian war. First, let's step back and look at what the Ukrainians themselves said. At the start of the war, the Ukrainian military outlined how they could win the war. They explained precisely the scale of support, equipment, and manpower they would need. They said, if not, we will fight a slow and losing attritional war, and eventually the front will collapse. They did not get the scale of support in military equipment, in intelligence sharing, or in manpower. And what we're seeing is precisely the meat grinder. And the losses, according to basically every statistic except for the CIA ones, is that the Ukrainians have sustained catastrophic losses, while Russia's fighting power has actually significantly increased since the start of the war. I mean, look at the shift in Russia's war economy to be able to produce so many drones. Now, to be frank, Russia has clearly held back significantly militarily. We've seen, I think, one launch of Russia's hypersonic missiles this whole time. They could have been launching them throughout. They, for political reasons, I think, strategically decided not to, but they showed their capacity. The Ukrainian populace is dwindling, actually, in numbers. Many of the mercenaries, for example, a bunch of the Mexican cartels who fought early in the war to get combat experience, have left. And the Zelensky government is increasingly rocked by one scandal after another, indicating the degree of actually infighting amongst them. All of this is creating the ideal conditions for Russia to advance. And the desperation of recent Ukrainian attacks on Russian oil and gas infrastructure, which have really escalated, I think speak to this reality. But simply put, Ukraine doesn't have the people to fight and win this war. And the conditions they outlined for their own defeat have already come into being. Fronts in wars like this hold until they collapse. And then, like a dam breaking, the troops surge forth. And I think we'll see that shortly in the Russia-Ukraine war.
Yeah, to build off that, while Russia has sustained very many casualties in the war, some bad approval ratings is not the same as there being a very large mass uproar against the war. There aren't mass demonstrations in the street in the same way that you saw with the Vietnam War in the US after they'd been in it for 4 years. The Russia's ability to continue the war is undeterred, and actually they stand in a much stronger position now with a friendly power Iran winning forward in the Middle East, and also the global prices of oil and gas, of which Russia are a major exporter, means that Russia's economic conditions are becoming more and more favorable. Danish politicians, even 1 year ago, not unlike the main news channels, but on the ones where they kind of discuss among themselves, publicly recognizing that we need to recognize that this war is not going to be won and it's a matter of time. So this is how the European bourgeoisie is talking about it. But yeah.
Okay, Fred. So the question is, if the picture painted here is true, and the imminent defeat of the US empire, at least in the Middle East, but maybe in large ways globally, and having to book a major retreat is true, then we'll face fascism here, no question. And meetings like this won't be possible. Communists will be executed in the street. Yeah, it's true. In order to prepare for this, a few things need to happen. There needs to be a rapid development of communist organization and its ties to the working class movement, such that actually a significant percentage of the communist organization's membership can be hidden amongst the working class. The state can't exactly discern who is in it and who is not. There needs to be methods, and I have a few thoughts on this, but I'm not going to get into these, I think for obvious reasons, to protect the leading bodies and organizations in communist organizations and the leading fighters amongst the working class to hide them, actually. And organizations need to develop security practices that can hide them from surveillance. Now, let's be real about the present state of US surveillance. We're not living in the Snowden era anymore. Things have developed significantly beyond that. I'm going to spell out a few basic realities that we're facing, and then people can kind of fill in the blanks about what could possibly be done. Your phone has an accelerometer in it. It may also have an Israeli explosive in it. Bibi has said that we make cell phones all over the world. Okay, accelerometer, leaving aside the Samsung option, as they call it, accelerometer can tell you exactly where your phone is, if it's in your right hand or your left hand, if it's in your back pocket or your front pocket, for every move you make. Your phone with 5G can film everything you do. It can record every word that's said around you, whether you have Siri on or off. There's hardware level backdoors into every single computer and smartphone in the world. There's no encryption that can hide you from the NSA. Your Wi-Fi, or any Wi-Fi, can be used to watch your physical movements through space. Not like you're on a laptop, they're watching you through your laptop. No, the Wi-Fi interference itself. Fiber optic cables are capable of being turned into, just based on the slight vibrations in the fiber optics, wiretaps for speech, not electronic speech, in-person speech, for up to 50 meters. These are a few of the basic security parameters. Then add in flock cameras, then add in the ability, forget about facial recognition. They can pick you out of a crowd in a protest based on how you walk and track you. And every single protest, they have drone swarms now. So this is the security environment we're dealing with. Any communist organization which exists in a modern fascist country has to be able to evade well enough detection and continue to exist and continue to maintain and deepen its ties to the masses. This is no small task. Being equipped to do things like this is part of, it's not all of, but it's part of what Lenin meant when he said a party needs to have professional revolutionaries. In the Russian context, it meant people like Alexander Shlepnikov, one of the Central Committee members of the Bolshevik Party, when he worked in Russia, which wasn't a fascist country, but was a very oppressive country under absolutism, didn't have electronic surveillance there, he had to sleep in a different location every single night. They had to do mass meetings in the woods. Let me ask you, leave aside drones. Do you think your mass meetings in the park are safe? They don't need a drone. They don't need a cell phone on you. There's parabolics. They can point a thing at you and listen to your conversation from a few hundred meters away. So you get a sense of what I'm talking about. These are the security parameters. Very challenging. But the key thing is protecting leadership, hiding it from the enemy, having redundancy of leadership, having collective leadership, and then having deep and thoroughgoing ties to the masses, such that you can exert tremendous pressure on the ruling class when they inevitably assassinate, arrest, imprison, torture, etc. communists. And we should be very clear. One of the founders of Palantir recently tweeted out on Twitter. Someone said something about killing communists. He said, "What else do you think Palantir was made for?" They understand this. We should too.
Just to build off of that, it's important we take this stuff extremely seriously, but we shouldn't take it as something that knocks us down. Because actually, the advent of spontaneous and wide-scale mass movement, which is possible, and the mass movement which can be accelerated and garnered by activity of the communists in the coming time, as the effect of this polycrisis, is the most effective defense that we can have when organizing these things. Many hundreds of thousands of people taking to the streets, participating in political actions, will make it harder, or at least possible, to make communists able to work under these conditions. Other than that, the dissatisfaction is not only among the most oppressed. You will also have people who actually work within tech companies, or who work with surveillance technology, or who are selling them, who work with it, who know how these things work, who are going to be sympathetic to the movement and will provide assistance. And there are also openings there. Yeah. That the bourgeoisie needs workers to produce their surveillance materials and all their technology. And they need to therefore make people who understand it, who don't fundamentally have their interest with them. That's a secondary thing, but also important to keep in mind.
Yeah, that's very well said. And lastly, I'll just state, and I didn't say this before, I spelled out a lot of ways in which the bourgeoisie has tremendous technological power, surveillance capabilities, etc. at their hands. These tools are not all powerful. They have flaws and vulnerabilities and shortcomings. You need to understand those and be able to take advantage of them. Right now, there's kind of an incipient, spontaneous movement of people dismantling in rage flock cameras all across the country. There's also a scandal emerging where flock cameras, which have huge security vulnerabilities, are being used to spy on a children's gymnastics studio in Atlanta. Like, watch the kids through the windows, actually, it was revealed. And there's a sort of emerging, like, incredible right-wing outcry over this, basically tied to the Epstein stuff, saying, holy shit, they're using this to, like, creep on children. So the bourgeoisie, in order to rally a strong base of support for something like fascism, will need to rally some of those people. And if they're showing that their surveillance technology is being used for pedophilic Epstein-related stuff, they're not going to get many of those people. So we have this sort of counterweight right now to our advantage. How long that'll last is uncertain, but we need to take advantage of those things too and work, as other people have already pointed out in their comments and questions, to undermine as much as possible the mass base of fascism. Historically, the Comintern parties made a tremendous mistake by underestimating the rise of fascism and seeing social democracy as either the greater threat or as akin to fascism, basically, at times saying one and then the other. This left them very vulnerable, and they had to play catch-up, basically, after the rise of Hitler to really properly fight fascism. And then they fought with some real heroism and solidity, but still made a bunch of mistakes. We have the benefit of learning from those lessons to not repeat those mistakes. And it's a very important task, and I'll just end with this because it's a very big question. If you feel daunted by it, study the lessons, successes and failures of the anti-fascist movement of the 20s and 30s. Learn from the mistakes and the successes of the Comintern. Let's repeat their successes and not repeat their mistakes. Okay, there was another question in back. The question is the modern-day Chinese Communist Party an ally of the people or the lesser evil? The short answer, as I see it, is neither. With the restoration of capitalism in China following the coup in 1976, between 5 and 10 million people were killed and imprisoned. The revolutionaries were rounded up. The collective farms were broken up. Deng Xiaoping said, "To get rich is glorious, but some must get rich first." He came to the US, he put on a cowboy hat, and oversaw one of the most brutal periods of primitive accumulation, in a certain sense, primitive accumulation by analogy, in the history of capitalism. By the time of Tiananmen Square, 300 million former peasants had become migrant laborers. This actually exceeded the amount of workers in state-owned enterprises and the unions there. The current party in China is a capitalist imperialist party. They exist as part of this party-state apparatus in China that's able to, in actually a fairly more efficient way in certain regards, well, first of all, they themselves are capitalists. They control the economy and the big corporations, both public and private, both the state-owned enterprises and the private corporations. And they basically discipline them to the best of their ability, and with all the subjectivisms that come with competing in an organization like the Chinese Communist Party, to make sure those corporations carried out the unified interests of the Chinese capitalist class, which includes the party officials, the upper ranks of them. This is in no way a lesser evil. And to fall into lesser evilism is to apply the logic here that we apply mistakenly, or people, not we, apply mistakenly in the US elections. To say, oh, the Democrats are lesser evil, or Trump's a lesser evil. There's no lesser evil when it comes to imperialism. There's imperialist powers fighting to dominate the people of the world.
And just to drill home that point, because I think it's actually extremely essential, not only that we don't let right populist trends win forward in this moment, but also that we don't let opportunism and illusions about the rising imperialist center in the East cloud our judgment in this time. Because it can be an easy sort of emotional rack to hang your own responsibility to act on, to say that there's this great rising socialist power which is going to come and save everything. In reality, as a communist, I've traveled some around the world, met a lot of communists from different countries, and I even met a couple actual communists from China. And what you hear from them is that you can't really organize independent labor unions, you can't organize political parties, you couldn't have a meeting like this, not openly at least, and there's basically open repression. every communist I've met from China has said that China is a fascist country already now. Of course, they don't have the military expansion that you saw with Germany and Europe in these ways. They don't really need to. The US is kind of screwing up their own world domination by itself. They just have to sit and wait. But internally, they are just as repressive, or at least nearly. And this is actually not something new, that when one imperialist power rises, people have illusions. When one imperialist power is falling, people have illusions by the others. The US, for a long time, was seen as the anti-colonial power. They had broken from the strength of the British imperialists, who was the greatest empire in the history of the world. It must be progressive when the Americans are grabbing the British colonies, when they are taking control of greater parts of the world. This was genuinely, especially when the US fought the Nazis in World War II, they had a huge support for the people. They were seen as something anti-imperialist and democratic. So in this way, I think, just looking at that historical example, we can't set our hopes over to another imperialist. We need to organize and fight and resist based on an independent working class analysis of the concrete conditions that doesn't fall into these illusions. And then actually build on the experience of the Chinese Revolution, which is one of the most, probably the most profound event in history other than the Russian Revolution, and actually see the very lively debates. Because if you study the Chinese Revolution, you very clearly see that what was defeated in 1976 when Mao died and the counter-revolution happened was an actual attempt at building socialism and moving towards communism. And that is such a rich experience for us to build on, and a strong inspiration that we can win, we can take the world, and we can fundamentally uproot the capitalist and imperialist system.
I think that's a good note to end on. I know I saw a few more hands, but we've been talking for a while, so I think we'll wrap here. We'll stick around to chat. If people have questions they want to come up and ask us, feel free to do so, but I think this will call it officially the end.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.